Picture a river that flows not just through land, but through time itself, a river that cradled the very first cities humanity ever built, then watched them crumble into dust. This is the Tigris, one of the great arteries of civilization, a waterway that has witnessed both miracles and tragedies across more than 3,000 years. It gave life to empires that shaped our world, from the Sumerians with their revolutionary inventions to the Babylonians with their legendary hanging gardens. Yet this same river could also unleash devastation, floods that swallowed whole cities, droughts that starved populations, and changes that toppled kingdoms. Its story is one of breathtaking creation and heartbreaking destruction, a cycle that repeated itself again and again as civilizations rose, flourished, and fell along its banks. What makes the Tigris so extraordinary isn't just its power, it's what it reveals about us. For millennia, humans have tried to control this river, bending it to our will with canals, dams, and laws. Sometimes we succeeded, building societies of astonishing complexity and beauty. Other times we failed spectacularly, our arrogance or short-sightedness turning our greatest resource into our undoing. The Tigris doesn't just carry water, it carries lessons about balance, humility, and the delicate dance between humanity and nature. And as we face our own modern challenges, climate change, water scarcity, environmental strain, we're grappling with many of the same forces that ancient civilizations confronted along these very shores. So join me on a journey back through time to explore how one river could both build and break the world's earliest civilizations. We'll walk the streets of ancient Uruk, stand in the shadow of Assyrian palaces, and trace the flow of history from then to now. By understanding the Tigris, its gifts, its warnings, its enduring legacy, we don't just learn about the past, we see a reflection of our own relationship with the planet, and perhaps find wisdom to shape a better future. This is more than history, it's a story about us. To truly grasp the immense power this river holds over human history, we must first trace its path. The Tigris begins its journey high in the rugged Taurus Mountains of eastern Turkey, as melting snow and fresh springs gather into a flowing current. It carves through steep valleys, gaining strength before it reaches the rolling plains of Mesopotamia, a name that literally means the land between the rivers. Here, it runs almost parallel to its sister river, the Euphrates, with a fertile strip of land between them forming the heartland of the world's earliest civilizations. The Tigris continues south, cutting through modern-day Iraq, flowing past Baghdad and through the vast marshlands, until it finally merges with the Euphrates to form the Shatt al-Arab waterway, emptying into the Persian Gulf. This geography wasn't just a backdrop, it was the main character in the story. The river's flow brought life-giving water and, crucially, deposited incredibly rich silt across the floodplains each year. This natural fertilization process created soil so productive it could support enormous harvests, allowing populations to grow far beyond what the surrounding arid deserts could ever sustain. But this bounty came with a price. The Tigris is a volatile and unpredictable river. Unlike the Nile's gentle annual floods, the Tigris could unleash devastating, sudden deluges that wiped out entire communities without warning, or it could withhold its waters, leading to crippling drought. This duality, the ability to give life and just as quickly take it away, defined every society that dared to build along its banks. This geographic reality made the Tigris a natural highway for not just water, but for ideas. Its currents carried more than silt, they carried goods, people, and innovations. Early farmers used simple reed boats to transport grain, pottery, and textiles, connecting isolated villages into a web of trade. This exchange went far beyond mere commerce. It facilitated the spread of language, religious beliefs, and technological breakthroughs. The wheel, the plow, the sailboat, many of these foundational inventions likely first appeared here, propelled by the need to manage and utilize the river's resources. This constant interaction and competition between different groups along the river is what ultimately led to an even more profound invention: writing. The need to record complex trade agreements, track agricultural yields, and administer growing cities gave rise to cuneiform, the world's first written script etched into wet clay tablets. From there, it was a short step to recording laws like the famous Code of Hammurabi, which included specific rules for managing water access and irrigation disputes. This was the birthplace of urban life, of bureaucracy, of organized religion, the very building blocks of what we call civilization. The Tigris provided the stage, the resources, and the connections that made this incredible burst of human creativity possible. Yet, this profound dependency was also the source of ultimate vulnerability. The very success of these river-based societies sowed the seeds of their potential downfall. To harness the Tigris, they built increasingly complex networks of canals and dikes. These irrigation systems allowed them to expand farmland and feed growing populations, but they also created a fragile, artificial reality. Societies became addicted to the constant, managed water supply. If the river's flow diminished due to a prolonged drought or a shift in climate, the entire agricultural system could collapse, leading to famine. If a catastrophic flood breached their defenses, it could wash away a season of crops and the infrastructure itself. Furthermore, intensive irrigation over centuries had a hidden, slow-acting consequence: salinization. As water evaporated from the fields, it left behind mineral salts that gradually poisoned the soil, reducing its fertility year after year. The river gave them everything, but it also made them complacent, locking them into a system that was incredibly productive but also terrifyingly brittle. The geographic blessings that allowed for the rise of cities like Nineveh, Ashur, and Ctesiphon also set a trap, one that would ensnare empire after empire. Understanding this landscape is the key that unlocks the entire epic. It shows us why this region was destined to be a repeated cradle of civilization, and why that cradle could so easily become a grave. Now, emerging from that fertile landscape around 4,000 years before the Common Era, we meet the first true architects of civilization, the Sumerians. They looked upon the unpredictable Tigris and saw not just a threat, but an opportunity. Their great innovation was a simple yet revolutionary concept. They would not just live by the river, they would command it. With nothing more than stone tools and an immense collective will, they began to dig. They carved the first canals, channeling the river's lifeblood directly to their fields, transforming the sun-baked plains into a sprawling green garden. This was the birth of large-scale irrigation, a technological leap that changed everything. For the first time, farmers could predictably water their crops, no longer at the complete mercy of the river's erratic floods. This control over water led to something previously unimaginable: a consistent surplus of food. This agricultural revolution was the engine that powered the rise of the world's first cities. Places like and Uruk exploded in size and complexity. When you don't have to spend every waking moment searching for or growing just enough food to survive, you free up human potential for other pursuits. This surplus allowed for specialization. Not everyone had to be a farmer anymore. Some people could become potters, crafting intricate vessels to store the surplus grain. Others became scribes, developing writing to keep track of it all. Artisans, priests, soldiers, and administrators, entire new classes of society, emerged from that one simple act of digging a ditch. The Sumerians were building more than cities. They were inventing urban life itself, creating a model of society that would be replicated for millennia to come. Their canals were the veins pumping vitality into the heart of a new world. But this incredible success contained the seeds of its own destruction. The same irrigation canals that brought life-giving water also brought a slow, invisible poison. In the hot Mesopotamian sun, water in the fields would evaporate quickly. While the water itself disappeared, the dissolved minerals it carried, salts, were left behind, steadily accumulating in the soil with every watering. Season after season, year after year, this salt built up, gradually creating a toxic environment for the very crops they were trying to grow. The Sumerians themselves left us a heartbreaking record of this decline. Ancient clay tablets shift from boasting of abundant wheat harvests to documenting increasingly larger fields being set aside for the more salt-tolerant barley. Later tablets lament the black fields becoming white as a crust of salt literally rose to the surface, rendering the land barren. Their technological marvel was silently turning against them, a classic case of solving one problem while inadvertently creating a far slower, more insidious one. The Sumerian story is our first clear example of a pattern we will see again and again along the Tigris. Human ingenuity provides a brilliant solution to an immediate challenge, creating a period of prosperity and growth. But that very solution introduces a new, long-term vulnerability that isn't immediately apparent. The Sumerians mastered flood control and irrigation, but in doing so, they made their entire society dependent on a fragile, artificially maintained system, and initiated a process of environmental degradation that would take centuries to fully play out. Their legacy is a powerful and enduring lesson. It reminds us that every great human advancement comes with hidden costs and unintended consequences. The choices we make to harness nature for our benefit echo far into the future, a truth the next civilizations along the Tigris would learn, often the hard way. Building on the foundation laid by the Sumerians, a new power emerged that would take the concept of a river-based empire to a breathtaking scale. This was the Akkadian Empire, and its story is one of meteoric rise and equally dramatic fall, a narrative deeply woven into the banks of the Tigris. At its heart was a legendary figure, Sargon of Akkad, whose origins are shrouded in a myth that he was placed in a reed basket and set adrift on the Euphrates, a story that fascinatingly echoes much later tales of powerful leaders. Sargon's genius was not just in conquest, but in his understanding of the river as a tool of unification. He didn't just defeat the independent Sumerian city-states, he integrated them, creating the world's first true multi-ethnic empire. The Tigris was the central highway that made this possible. His armies could move with surprising speed along its course, projecting power across vast distances to enforce his rule. The river also facilitated a new level of trade, with goods and ideas flowing seamlessly from the north down to the Persian Gulf, binding diverse cultures into a single economic and political unit. For a time, this system created unprecedented stability and wealth, a golden age where the Akkadian language became the lingua franca of the entire region and artistic expression flourished under imperial patronage. Yet, this very strength, the centralized, river-dependent system, contained the seeds of its own vulnerability. The empire's agricultural heartland, feeding its growing population and massive armies, was utterly reliant on the same intricate network of canals first pioneered by the Sumerians. To support their expansion, the Akkadians likely expanded these irrigation works even further, drawing more and more water from the Tigris and its tributaries to cultivate new land. In the short term, this was a masterstroke of administrative planning, but it may have created a long-term ecological debt. Scientists studying sediment cores from archaeological sites and geological layers have uncovered compelling evidence of a catastrophic climatic shift right around the time of the empire's collapse. These paleoclimatic records point to a severe and prolonged mega-drought that gripped the region for decades, possibly even centuries. Imagine the Tigris, that mighty artery of life, slowly shrinking. Its flow would have diminished, leaving the extensive canal networks high and dry. Crops would have failed, not just for one season, but repeatedly, leading to widespread famine. This environmental catastrophe acted as a devastating multiplier of existing social and political strains. An empire built on the promise of grain and order could not survive its failure to provide either. The famine would have sparked mass migrations from the countryside into the cities, desperate for food that was no longer there. This in turn would have led to skyrocketing prices, social unrest, and a crippling loss of faith in the central government's authority. The very regions that Sargon had unified by force saw their chance to break away, and the empire began to fragment from within. The Akkadian collapse wasn't just about a drought. It was about a drought hitting a society that had become hyper-specialized and overly dependent on a single, fragile system. They had mastered the river to build an empire, but they could not master the climate. Their story is a powerful cautionary tale about the limits of control. It shows that even the most brilliantly organized human systems, the most powerful armies, and the most advanced engineering can be undone by environmental forces. The Akkadians reached higher than any civilization before them, but their dependence on the Tigris made their foundation precarious, a lesson in humility that echoes down through the centuries to our own era of climate uncertainty. Out of the political fragments left by the Akkadian collapse, a new city began its ascent to greatness, one whose name would become synonymous with ancient wonder and power: Babylon. Situated strategically on the banks of the Euphrates, yet deeply connected to the lifeblood of the Tigris through a network of canals, Babylon's rise was a masterclass in turning a river's potential into an empire's reality. Under the ambitious and shrewd leadership of King Hammurabi around 1792 BCE, the city transformed from a regional power into the capital of an empire that would dominate Mesopotamia for centuries. The Tigris and its sister river were the superhighways of their day, and Hammurabi understood this better than anyone. He used these waterways to move troops swiftly, to put down rebellions, to transport goods across vast distances, and to facilitate a level of economic integration that brought immense wealth flowing directly into his capital. This wasn't just about military might. It was about creating a stable, prosperous, and interconnected state where trade could flourish, and with it, culture, art, and innovation. The most enduring legacy of this Babylonian golden age is, without a doubt, Hammurabi's Code. Inscribed on a towering black stone stele for all to see, this was one of the earliest and most complete sets of written laws in human history. And right there, carved into the basalt for eternity, were specific clauses dealing with the most vital resource in Mesopotamian life: water. The code meticulously laid out responsibilities and liabilities for irrigation. If a landowner was careless and allowed his canal to overflow, flooding his neighbor's field, he was legally obligated to compensate him for the lost grain. This was revolutionary. It moved water management out of the realm of local custom or potential violent dispute and into the sphere of state-enforced law. It created a framework of predictable justice that gave farmers the confidence to invest in their land and their irrigation systems, knowing that there was a legal recourse if a neighbor's negligence damaged their livelihood. This legal innovation was as important as any technological breakthrough in dam or canal building. It provided the social and administrative stability needed to support the complex, society-wide system that depended entirely on the river's bounty. This stability, protected by law and enabled by the river, paved the way for cultural achievements that still capture our imagination. While the legendary Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were likely built centuries later, they are a powerful symbol of the advanced hydraulic engineering the Babylonians were capable of. Ancient sources describe an astonishing multi-tiered structure, a green mountain of terraced gardens rising above the flat plains, kept lush and alive by a complex system of screws, pumps, and cisterns that lifted water from the Euphrates to incredible heights. Whether the gardens were a historical fact or a powerful legend, they represent a pinnacle of ambition, the ultimate human desire to not just harness nature, but to sculpt it into a thing of breathtaking beauty. They stand as a testament to what was possible when the Tigris-Euphrates system was functioning smoothly, a society so secure and so advanced that it could pour its resources into creating a paradise on earth. Yet, even the most brilliant laws and the most sophisticated engineering could not grant total control over the forces of nature. The very success of Babylonian agriculture and Chinese letter ED, a slower, more geological threat siltation. The Tigris, by its very nature, carries enormous amounts of silt eroded from the northern highlands. As the Babylonians' extensive network of canals diverted water to fields, this silt gradually settled out, accumulating on the canal bottoms and riverbanks. Over generations, this relentless process made the canals shallower, reducing their water-carrying capacity and making them increasingly difficult and labor-intensive to maintain. More critically, this silt buildup began to affect the main channels of the rivers themselves. The once deep and easily navigable waterways slowly became choked, impeding the trade ships that were the empire's economic lifelines. The cost of constant dredging and canal clearance became a heavier and heavier burden on the state. Furthermore, the rivers themselves were not static, they were dynamic, living systems. Historical evidence suggests periodic shifts in the course of the Euphrates, which could have left major irrigation canals high and dry and rendered vast tracts of fertile farmland suddenly inaccessible. A civilization built on the promise of predictable water could not easily adapt when that promise was broken by the river's slow, meandering will. The Babylonian era thus presents us with a more nuanced lesson than those that came before. The Sumerians showed us the danger of unintended environmental consequences like salinization. The Akkadians demonstrated the vulnerability of an overextended empire to climatic shock. The Babylonians, with their legal codes and engineering marvels, show us that humanity can create brilliant systems to manage risk and foster prosperity. Hammurabi's laws could adjudicate a water dispute between two farmers, but they could not legislate the Tigris to stop shedding its silt. Their engineers could design machines to lift water to celestial gardens, but they could not stop the river from changing its course over centuries. Their innovations mitigated immediate risks and solved human-made problems, but they could not eliminate the fundamental, long-term geological and hydrological forces that ultimately shaped their destiny. Their decline was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, grinding process of increasing maintenance costs and decreasing returns, a reminder that no amount of human ingenuity can ever fully insulate a civilization from the persistent, patient power of a great river. If the Babylonians demonstrated the power of law and administration, their successors to the north, the Assyrians, took the concept of controlling the river to an entirely new level, fusing hydraulic engineering with raw military power in a way the world had never seen. By around 700 BCE, the Assyrian Empire was the terrifying superpower of the ancient Near East, a realm built on a foundation of calculated terror and stunning logistical brilliance. At the heart of this war machine was the Tigris River, transformed from a life-giver into a strategic weapon. The Assyrians were masters of psychological warfare, and they understood that a river could be a tool of conquest as much as any sword or spear. They would use the Tigris's flow to their absolute advantage, moving armies of tens of thousands of men with shocking speed along its course to launch devastating surprise attacks on their enemies. But their most terrifying innovation was the use of water in siegecraft. Ancient inscriptions and reliefs from royal palaces depict a chillingly effective tactic. When laying siege to a fortified city, Assyrian engineers would often divert a nearby river or dam a stream to create a massive reservoir of water. Then, at the crucial moment, they would release this pent-up force in a catastrophic deluge, deliberately smashing the enemy's mud-brick walls and literally washing their defenses away. This was shock and awe, ancient style, using the very force of nature itself as a weapon of mass destruction to break a city's spirit before a single soldier even needed to climb the ramparts. This military genius was matched by an equally ambitious vision for their own heartland. To fuel their expanding empire, they needed to support a huge population, including a massive standing army and a vast administrative bureaucracy. Their answer was to build a capital city on a scale that dwarfed all others, Nineveh. Ancient texts describe it as an immense metropolis, a city of wonders, protected by walls so long and high they inspired awe and fear. But a city of that size, located on the banks of the Tigris, presented an enormous logistical problem. It consumed more water than the river could reliably provide, especially during the dry summer months. The Assyrian solution was a breathtaking feat of engineering. King Sennacherib, in a boastful inscription that has survived millennia, detailed his greatest pride, a system of canals and aqueducts that stretched over 50 miles, channeling water from mountain springs and rivers in the north all the way to the gates of Nineveh. The jewel in this crown was the Jerwan Aqueduct, a monumental structure of stone and mortar that carried water across a valley. This wasn't just a ditch in the ground, it was one of the first known stone aqueducts in history, predating the famous Roman aqueducts by centuries. This network ensured a constant, reliable water supply for the city's gardens, royal palaces, and most importantly, for the irrigation of the vast fields that fed the empire. It was the ultimate expression of control, a declaration that the Assyrians could not only command the river's flow for war, but could also bend the entire landscape to their will for peace and prosperity. For a time, this system of absolute control created an unstoppable force. The Assyrian Empire seemed invincible, a colossus bestriding the world. Their armies were unbeatable, their capital was impregnable, and their agricultural output was secure. But this very strength was built upon a foundation of extreme and centralized fragility. The entire arrangement was a meticulously balanced house of cards. The immense population of Nineveh and the surrounding agricultural lands became utterly dependent on that man-made water network. The canals and aqueducts required constant, meticulous maintenance by a huge workforce to clear silt and repair breaches. The entire system, in turn, was completely reliant on a predictable flow of water from the northern sources. The Assyrians had engineered their society to peak efficiency, but in doing so, they had eliminated any margin for error. They had created a civilization with no backup plan. And then the climate shifted. Paleoclimatologists studying stalagmites in caves and sediment layers from distant lakes have uncovered compelling evidence that the late 7th century BCE was marked by a period of severe and prolonged drought throughout the region. The mountain springs that fed Sennacherib's magnificent aqueducts would have dwindled to a trickle. The tributaries that topped up the Tigris ran low. This wasn't a single bad season. It was a climatic shift that likely lasted for years, maybe even decades. Suddenly, the aqueducts ran dry. The canals sat empty. The fields that fed the army began to crack under the sun. Famine would have swept through the empire, triggering immense social unrest. The outlying provinces, already chafing under the brutal weight of Assyrian rule, saw their chance to rebel when the central power could no longer feed its own troops or project its force. The mighty army, deprived of its grain supply, would have weakened and fragmented. In a staggeringly short period of time, this seemingly invincible empire collapsed with breathtaking speed. A coalition of Babylonians and Medes swept in, sacking the great city of Nineveh in 612 BCE. The empire that had terrorized the world for centuries was gone, almost in the blink of an eye. The Assyrian story delivers one of the most stark and powerful lessons in all of history. They were the supreme masters of military power, logistical planning, and engineering. They could defeat any human enemy on the battlefield and could reshape geography itself to serve their needs. Yet, all that calculated might and brilliance could not protect them from a change in the weather. Their collapse is a timeless testament to the fact that no amount of military strength can ultimately safeguard a civilization against environmental fragility. They built the most sophisticated system the world had ever seen, but in making it so efficient and so centralized, they also made it exquisitely vulnerable. When the water stopped flowing, the empire stopped functioning. It is a profound reminder that true resilience lies not in total control, but in building flexibility and adaptability into the very heart of a society, because nature always has the final move. From the ashes of the Assyrian collapse, a new and profoundly different kind of empire arose, one that would approach the challenge of the Tigris not with the brute force of a conqueror, but with the meticulous mind of an administrator. This was the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and its founder, Cyrus the Great, possessed a vision of rule that was revolutionary for its time. Instead of simply crushing the cultures they absorbed, the Persians sought to integrate them, creating a vast, multicultural tapestry of peoples stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. The Tigris region, the ancient heartland of Mesopotamia, became a prized satrapy or province within this colossal domain. Cyrus and his successors understood that to govern such a diverse and far-flung empire, they needed stability and prosperity, and that all flowed from one source, water. So they embarked on a grand project of hydraulic improvement, not to showcase their own glory, but to ensure the smooth functioning of their state. They repaired and expanded the ancient canal networks first dug by the Sumerians and maintained by the Babylonians, ensuring that water reached further and more reliably than before. But their most significant innovation was not in the clay of the canals themselves, but in the organization behind them. They established one of history's first large-scale bureaucracies dedicated to water management. A class of imperial officials known as canal inspectors was tasked with overseeing maintenance, settling local disputes over water rights, and ensuring the equitable distribution of this most precious resource according to the needs of the land and the decrees of the king. This was governance as a practical art, the recognition that an empire's true strength was measured not just by the size of its army, but by the fertility of its fields and the contentment of its people. This administrative genius unlocked the Tigris's potential as a great economic unifier. The river became the liquid spine of the famous Royal Road, an astonishing highway of its time that stretched over 1,600 miles from the Persian capital of Susa all the way to the Aegean coast. While the road itself was a feat of overland engineering, it was the Tigris that served as a parallel aquatic highway, carrying the heavy, bulk goods that were the lifeblood of the empire. Grain from Mesopotamian fields, timber floated down from the northern highlands, and textiles from Babylonian workshops all moved along its currents. This fluid network connected the incredible diversity of the Persian realm. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles flowed as freely as the goods. A merchant in Babylon could access goods from Egypt, a craftsman in Persepolis could be inspired by Greek designs, and an administrator in Susa could deploy accounting methods perfected in Mesopotamia. The Tigris was no longer just a local lifeline. It was a central artery in the first truly global economy, fostering a period of cross-cultural exchange and economic growth that was unprecedented. The stability provided by the Persian bureaucracy meant that for generations farmers could plan for the future, merchants could predict the costs of their journeys, and the empire could count on a steady stream of tax revenue from this rich, productive heartland. Yet, this very system of centralized control and extraction contained the seeds of its own undoing. The immense cost of maintaining the imperial bureaucracy, the standing army, and the grand building projects in the royal capitals fell heavily on the provinces. Over time, the tax demands on the agricultural output of the Tigris region became increasingly burdensome. To meet these demands, farmers were pushed to extract more and more from the land. They likely expanded irrigation to marginal lands, increased cropping intensity, and cut corners on the meticulous canal maintenance that was so vital for long-term health. This relentless pressure led to the slow, insidious depletion of the very resources that powered the empire. Soil exhaustion and the old enemy of salinization would have gradually reduced yields, even as the tax collectors demanded more. The Persian system was brilliant at managing for stability and efficiency in the short to medium term, but it was less adept at recognizing and responding to these creeping environmental limits. The bureaucracy was designed to collect taxes, not to monitor topsoil depth or water table levels. The empire became a victim of its own success, slowly eroding the ecological foundation upon which it was built. This underlying vulnerability was then catastrophically exposed by the whirlwind that was Alexander the Great. His conquest of the Persian Empire in the 3rd century BCE was not merely a change in leadership, it was a devastating shock to the entire system. The wars of conquest themselves would have caused widespread disruption, damaging infrastructure and displacing populations. But the true blow to the Tigris region's stability came from the aftermath. Alexander's sudden death left his vast new territory with no clear successor, plunging the entire region into decades of brutal wars between his rival generals, known as the Wars of the Diadochi. These conflicts were fought back and forth across Mesopotamia, a prized jewel everyone wanted to control. The intricate and delicate system of canals and water administration, which required constant, peaceful oversight to function, was completely neglected amidst the chaos of endless campaigning. Canals silted up without maintenance, dikes burst and were not repaired, and the bureaucratic class that managed the water was likely dispersed or destroyed. The conquest did not just change the ruler, it shattered the entire administrative machine that had kept the Tigris region productive for generations. The political upheaval compounded the slow-burning environmental stresses, pushing the agricultural system over a tipping point from which it would take centuries to fully recover. The lesson of the Achaemenid Persians is therefore a crucial one in our story. They demonstrate that sophisticated governance and administrative systems can be a powerful bulwark against environmental uncertainty. Their centralized management of water was a tremendous force for stability and integration, creating a golden age of prosperity that was the envy of the ancient world. But they also show us the limitations of this approach. A system focused primarily on extraction and tax revenue can become blind to the slow degradation of the natural resources it depends on. And perhaps most importantly, their story highlights how fragile even the most well-managed systems are in the face of sudden, violent political rupture. The Tigris could sustain an empire through wise governance, but it could not protect that empire from the sword. The river's bounty was a source of strength, but it also made the region a perpetual target, a prize that would be fought over for millennia to come, reminding us that human conflict and environmental destiny are forever intertwined. But while the ambitions of emperors and engineers shaped the destiny of civilizations along the Tigris, there was always a far more powerful, invisible player at the table, the climate itself. For all their canals and codes, these ancient societies were ultimately at the mercy of forces they could neither predict nor control. The story of the Tigris is not just a chronicle of human achievement, it is a stark record of how nature's moods could amplify human errors into catastrophic failures. Modern science now allows us to read this history written not in clay, but in the very landscape, by examining the growth rings of ancient trees and analyzing layers of sediment pulled from the bottoms of lakes and the Persian Gulf. Paleoclimatologists have pieced together a precise timeline of environmental change. These natural archives tell a story of dramatic and often abrupt shifts. Thin, stressed tree rings from ancient junipers tell of years when the rains simply never came. Layers of coarse gravel in sediment cores speak of sudden, massive floods that scoured the land, while fine silt layers point to long, peaceful periods of steady deposition. This evidence reveals that the Tigris Basin was never a stable paradise. It was a region prone to violent climatic mood swings, cycling between periods of abundant rainfall and devastating megadroughts that could last for decades. These weren't mere inconveniences, they were empire-breaking events. The megadrought that struck around 4,200 years ago, revealed in those stressed tree rings and dry lake beds, aligns almost perfectly with the sudden and utter collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Imagine the slow, creeping horror of that time. The winter rains would have become lighter, less reliable year after year. The snowpack in the distant Taurus Mountains, the source of the Tigris, would have diminished. The great river itself, the lifeblood of the empire, would have shrunk in its channel. The elaborate irrigation networks, the pride of Sargon's administration, would have begun to fail, their intake canals reaching for a receding shoreline. The fields that fed the cities and the massive standing army would have first yielded smaller harvests, then failed completely. Famine would have sparked a desperate chain reaction, social order crumbling, provinces rebelling against a central authority that could no longer provide the most basic guarantee of food, and mass migrations of starving people overwhelming what little stability remained. The climate shift didn't create the empire's weaknesses, its overextension and reliance on a single system, but it exposed them with brutal efficiency, pushing a complex society past its breaking point. Conversely, the climate could also unleash its fury in the opposite direction, with equally devastating results. The same sediment cores that show periods of drought also contain layers of sudden, catastrophic flood deposits. The Tigris, fueled by unusually heavy snowmelt or concentrated torrential rains in its upper reaches, could transform in hours from a life-giving stream into a raging, brown torrent of destruction. These events were the stuff of legend, likely giving rise to the great flood myths found in texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh and later, the Bible. For the people living along its banks, a major flood was an existential crisis. It could in an instant wipe out an entire season of carefully tended crops, not just by drowning them, but by scouring the fertile topsoil itself down to the barren subsoil. It could demolish the intricate networks of canals and dikes that had taken generations to build and maintain, setting back agricultural productivity for years. A single night of catastrophic flooding could erase the stored surplus grain that was a city's insurance against future lean years, plunging a thriving community into immediate and desperate famine. Where drought was a slow, suffocating killer, flood was a sudden, apocalyptic blow. The true lesson, however, lies not in viewing these natural disasters as isolated, external events that simply happened to these civilizations. The real insight is in understanding how they interacted with the human-made vulnerabilities we've already explored. A prolonged drought was manageable for a small, nomadic society that could move to find water. But for a massive, densely populated empire utterly dependent on intensive irrigation, it was a death sentence. A catastrophic flood was a recoverable setback for a Chinese letter ED society with diverse resources. But for a hyper-specialized, centralized state where all the food production was focused on one river's floodplain, it could be a knockout punch. The climate provided the shock, but the societal structure determined how catastrophic that shock would be. The Akkadians and Assyrians had built magnificent, intricate houses of cards. They were brilliant, awe-inspiring structures, but they were still houses of cards. The mega-droughts and the floods were the winds that finally blew them over. This interplay between human choice and environmental change is the recurring theme of the Tigris. It shows us that civilizations don't typically fall from a single cause, but from a toxic cocktail of internal pressures and external shocks. A reminder that our own fate is tied to how we build our societies on a foundation that is far less stable than we often assume. And so we arrive at one of the most enduring and paradoxical themes in the entire history of the Tigris: the human compulsion to engineer nature itself. For millennia, the societies along this river looked upon its powerful, unpredictable flow and saw a puzzle to be solved. They were not content to simply accept its gifts and its punishments. They were driven to rewire its very essence, to impose a human sense of order upon a force of nature. This story of canals and dams is a story of breathtaking ambition, a testament to our species' refusal to bow to circumstance. Yet, woven through every triumph of engineering is a counter-narrative of unintended consequences, a slow-burning ecological debt that would eventually come due. It's a cycle that began not in the modern era with concrete and steel, but in the ancient world with little more than shovels, sweat, and sheer determination. The fundamental logic behind these projects was, on its surface, undeniably sound. The Tigris was a volatile provider. Its water came in great, destructive surges during flood season and could become a scarce trickle during times of drought. The goal of every engineer, from the Sumerian overseer to the modern hydrologist, was to smooth out these wild fluctuations to create a predictable, manageable resource. Canals were the first and most crucial innovation, acting like artificial arteries to carry water away from the main channel and distribute it deep into the surrounding farmland. This allowed civilizations to expand their cultivated territory far beyond the natural floodplain, supporting larger populations and creating the agricultural surpluses that built cities. Dams, whether simple earthen barriers or later, more complex structures, served as reservoirs, capturing the precious floodwaters to be released gradually during the dry months. For a ruler, commissioning such a project was the ultimate act of statecraft. It demonstrated power provided for the people and created a legacy of prosperity. The Sassanid Empire, which rose to power in the 3rd century after the Common Era, stands as a classic example of this boom. They constructed a vast and sophisticated network of canals across Mesopotamia, most famously the Narawan Canal system. This wasn't just a ditch in the ground. It was a monumental feat of surveying and labor, hundreds of miles long. designed to irrigate thousands of square miles of previously marginal land. For centuries, it worked magnificently, turning the region into a breadbasket that fueled the Sassanid war machine and cemented their status as a rival to the Roman Empire. The short-term gains were enormous, creating a golden age of agricultural output and economic strength. But the river's hydrology is a complex system, and engineering a change in one part of it inevitably triggers a chain reaction elsewhere. The most immediate and pervasive consequence was siltation. The Tigris carries an immense load of fine sediment eroded from the mountains of its upper reaches. In its natural state during annual floods, this silt would be spread across the floodplain, constantly renewing the soil's fertility. But when water was diverted into canals, it slowed down. As it slowed, it could no longer hold all that suspended sediment, which then settled to the bottom of the canals themselves. This created a relentless, Sisyphean task for maintenance crews. Every year, the canals would get shallower, requiring back-breaking labor to dredge them out. If this maintenance was neglected for even a few seasons due to war, political instability, or lack of resources, the entire system could become choked and useless. Furthermore, by trapping the silt in the canals, engineers were inadvertently starving the downstream fields of that annual renewal of fresh, fertile soil. The land beyond the canals, deprived of its natural nutrient top-up, would gradually become less productive, forcing ever greater reliance on the very artificial system that was causing the problem in the first place. The second great unintended consequence was waterlogging and salinity, a silent, invisible plague that could poison the land from below. Extensive irrigation without adequate drainage meant that far more water was being poured onto the fields than the crops could use or the sun could evaporate. This excess water percolated down through the soil, slowly raising the underlying water table. Eventually, it could rise so high that it drowned the roots of plants, effectively waterlogging the field and killing the crops. But an even more insidious process was at work. As the high water table sat beneath the sun-baked Mesopotamian plain, capillary action drew the water upward through the soil. The water would evaporate at the surface, but the salts and minerals it carried were left behind, forming a toxic, crystalline crust that could make the land utterly barren. This was salinization, the same slow poison that had weakened the Sumerians, and it was an inescapable byproduct of large-scale irrigation in an arid climate. The very act of bringing life-giving water to the land was, over the long term, creating the conditions for its own destruction. The Sassanids, for all their engineering prowess, were eventually haunted by these very issues. Historical records and archaeological evidence suggest that over centuries, the productivity of their grand canal systems declined as waterlogging and salinity took their toll, weakening the agricultural base that supported their empire and making it more vulnerable to collapse. This dynamic created a profound and dangerous dependency. A society that built a vast irrigation network didn't just add an option. It fundamentally reshaped its entire existence around that artificial water supply. Populations grew to levels that the natural river could never support. Economies became specialized around water-intensive crops. The entire social and political order became predicated on the continuous, flawless operation of these hydraulic systems. This made these civilizations incredibly brittle. They had traded the uncertain bounty of a natural river for the precarious control of an engineered one. If anything disrupted the complex, labor-intensive maintenance regime, a prolonged war that diverted manpower, a political crisis that dissolved central authority, or a climate shift that altered the river's flow, the entire house of cards could collapse. The engineered system didn't just fail, it took the civilization that depended on it down with it. The history of the Tigris is littered with the ghosts of these hydraulic societies, reminders that our greatest innovations often weave the ropes of our own dependency. The canals and dams were monuments to human ingenuity, but they were also traps beautifully designed and utterly inescapable when the world suddenly changed. Yet even as the light of the Persian and Roman worlds dimmed, a new and brilliant flame was kindled along the banks of the Tigris, one that would illuminate a golden age of human achievement. With the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century and the founding of their magnificent new capital, Baghdad, in 762, the river found itself at the very center of the civilized world. The city's location was a masterstroke of geographic planning, situated in a vast loop of the Tigris that provided natural defenses and, more importantly, unparalleled access to the waterway that was its lifeblood. Baghdad quickly blossomed into a metropolis of staggering size and sophistication, a bustling crossroads of global trade and a beacon of intellectual curiosity. The Tigris was the throbbing heart of this new world. Its waters carried a constant flow of river traffic, elegant dhows and sturdy barges laden with spices from India, silks from China, paper from Samarkand, and scientific texts from the far corners of the known world. The river wasn't just a transport route, it was the engine of the economy and the vital force that sustained the city's immense population. To harness this power, Abbasid engineers perfected and deployed technologies on a scale never before seen. Most iconic among them were the norias, the massive water wheels that lined the riverbanks. These great wooden wheels, often several stories tall, were turned by the relentless current of the Tigris itself. As they rotated, a series of clay pots or wooden boxes mounted on their rims would dip into the river, scoop up water, and lift it high into aqueducts and canals that fed a complex network distributing water throughout the city for drinking, bathing, and most critically, for irrigating the vast gardens and farms that supplied the markets of Baghdad. This was hydraulic engineering in the service of a grand urban vision, a symbiotic relationship between the city and the river that allowed both to flourish. This reliable water supply, managed with such skill, provided the stable foundation upon which the Islamic Golden Age was built. It's no coincidence that an era of such breathtaking intellectual ferment occurred in a society that had mastered its most basic resource. The agricultural surplus generated by sophisticated irrigation meant that not every pair of hands was needed for farming. This freed up a vast segment of the population to pursue other endeavors, to become scholars, astronomers, mathematicians, doctors, poets, and artists. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly the legendary Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, actively championed this pursuit of knowledge, establishing the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, in Baghdad. This was more than a library. It was the world's first major research institute, a vibrant academy where scholars of different faiths and cultures, Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, worked side by side to translate, critique, and expand upon the knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. The stable, prosperous society supported by the Tigris created the conditions for this incredible intellectual exchange. Scholars didn't have to worry about their next meal. They could devote themselves to mapping the stars, developing algebra, refining the astrolabe, or debating the finer points of philosophy. The river's water, lifted by the norias, was literally fueling the minds that were advancing human understanding in every conceivable field. It was a virtuous cycle. Wise water management created prosperity, which fostered learning, which in turn led to even better techniques for managing water and other resources. But this golden age, for all its brilliance, was built upon the same fragile premise as the empires that came before it. It required uninterrupted political stability and continuous, careful maintenance. The intricate web of canals, norias, and aqueducts was a masterpiece, but it was not a self-sustaining one. It demanded constant vigilance and investment. Silt needed to be dredged from canals, wooden water wheels needed to be repaired and replaced, and the entire system required a strong central authority to coordinate its operation and resolve disputes. For centuries, the Abbasid state provided this, but as internal political fractures began to appear and the caliph's power gradually waned, the first signs of neglect likely began to set in. Even so, the system possessed a tremendous inertia, and it continued to function, though perhaps with diminishing efficiency. The true death blow, however, came not from within, but from a cataclysm of almost unimaginable violence and destruction from without. In 1258, the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The siege was short and brutally effective. The city was sacked, its libraries burned, its inhabitants massacred, and its grandeur reduced to rubble. But beyond the immediate human tragedy, the Mongols inflicted a wound on the land itself. Their armies, comprised of horsemen from the steppes with little understanding or care for the complex hydraulic civilization they had conquered, systematically destroyed the irrigation infrastructure that was the region's life support system. Canals were deliberately breached and filled in, norias were smashed, and the intricate water distribution networks were left to decay. This was not merely collateral damage. It was a deliberate act of ecological warfare designed to break the back of the region's productive capacity and ensure it could never again rise to challenge Mongol rule. The aftermath of the invasion was a descent into a long, dark age of neglect. Without a powerful central state to organize and fund their repair, the great waterworks of Mesopotamia fell into utter disrepair. The canals that had once pulsed with life silted up completely, becoming mere scars on the landscape. The fields they had watered for centuries slowly desiccated, their fertility fading as the water table dropped, and the old enemy of salinity returned with a vengeance. The agricultural abundance that had fed millions and funded a renaissance of learning vanished, replaced by scarcity and a return to a more localized, subsistence-level existence. The Tigris still flowed, but its waters were no longer commanded, they were wasted. The region that had been a global center of power, wealth, and knowledge was now an economic and intellectual backwater. The lesson of the Abbasid rise and fall is perhaps the most poignant in our entire story. It demonstrates the absolute pinnacle of what human civilization can achieve when it learns to live in harmony with a great river, using technology and wise governance to create a period of sustained prosperity that unlocks humanity's full creative potential. But it also stands as a stark warning about the breathtaking fragility of those achievements. Centuries of progress, innovation, and cultural magnificence could be undone in a matter of years by an external shock that targeted the very foundation of it all. The Mongol invasion was a sudden, violent reminder that the river gives, but it does not protect. The knowledge to manage it can be preserved in books, but the will and the resources to do so can be swept away in an instant, leaving the most advanced society to wither on the vine. For centuries after the Mongols, the lands of the Tigris languished, a shadow of their former glory, until a new imperial power arrived to impose its own order. The Ottoman Empire, rising from the ashes of Byzantium, eventually extended its reach over Mesopotamia, claiming the Tigris basin as a distant but valuable province. The Ottoman approach to this legendary river was not one of rejuvenation or grand innovation, but of pragmatic, often distant administration. Their primary interest was not in restoring the region to its ancient agricultural peak, but in ensuring it served the broader needs of the empire, namely, as a source of tax revenue and a strategic buffer against rivals like the Persian Safavids. The intricate, decaying waterworks they inherited from the Abbasid era were viewed not as a system to be revived in its entirety, but as assets to be managed for minimum investment and maximum return. They maintained the most crucial canals, those that fed the major towns and garrison cities, ensuring a basic level of productivity to fund their military expeditions and the lavish court in faraway Istanbul. But the vast, sprawling networks that had once turned the entire region into a garden were largely left to the elements, their silted channels and broken norias becoming permanent features of the landscape. This was management by neglect, a policy that prioritized immediate imperial stability over long-term regional health. This extractive mindset was deeply embedded in the Ottoman system of land tenure. Much of the agricultural land was organized into timurs, estates granted to cavalry officers in exchange for military service. These sepahis, as they were known, were absentee landlords whose primary concern was collecting enough grain and taxes from their lands to equip themselves and their soldiers for the Sultan's next campaign. They had little personal incentive to invest in the long-term health of the land or to finance the costly, labor-intensive dredging of ancient canals. Their focus was on short-term yield, not sustainable stewardship. This system stood in stark contrast to the centralized, bureaucratic oversight of the ancient Persians or the Abbasids. There was no powerful ministry of water in Constantinople dedicated to the Tigris. Its care was a local issue, underfunded and overlooked. The result was a slow, steady degradation. Without constant maintenance, the remaining functional canals silted up further, their capacity diminishing with each passing year. Farmers, facing higher taxes and less reliable water, were forced onto more marginal land or began to over-irrigate the fields they had, accelerating the twin processes of waterlogging and soil salinization that had plagued the region since Sumerian times. The empire was, in effect, consuming the land's remaining fertility like a capital reserve, with no thought for replenishment. The consequences of this long-term neglect became painfully visible during the empire's long, slow decline from the 17th century onward. As the central government in Istanbul grew weaker, more corrupt, and perpetually cash-strapped from endless wars, its already tenuous grip on distant provinces like Mesopotamia loosened even further. Investment in infrastructure evaporated completely. The periodic, devastating floods that had always been a feature of the Tigris became exponentially more destructive. Why? Because the network of maintained canals and dikes that had once acted as a relief valve, absorbing and diverting excess floodwaters, was now largely gone. When the spring snowmelt surged down from the Taurus Mountains, the river had nowhere to go but over its banks, unleashing its full, untamed force directly onto settlements and fields. Historical records from the 18th and 19th centuries are filled with accounts of these catastrophic inundations, whole villages washed away, granaries ruined, and thousands left homeless. Each flood would scour away more precious topsoil, while the receding waters would leave behind not fertile silt, but swamps of stagnant water that bred disease like malaria. The land was caught in a vicious cycle. Less maintenance led to more destructive floods, which caused more economic damage, which left even fewer resources for maintenance. This environmental decay went hand in hand with economic stagnation and social misery. The great cities of the region, like Baghdad and Mosul, became impoverished shadows of their former selves. The vibrant trade that had once pulsed along the Tigris dwindled to a trickle as the river became less navigable and the region produced fewer goods worth trading. Periodic famines, once rare in this land of plenty, became a recurring nightmare. A bad harvest caused by drought or a particularly destructive flood could no longer be offset by grain shipments from other well-irrigated parts of an integrated empire. The local population was left to starve, their resilience eroded by centuries of imperial indifference. The Ottoman legacy along the Tigris is therefore a critical lesson in the economics of empire. It demonstrates that stability and control are not the same as sustainability. An empire can maintain political order for centuries while simultaneously presiding over the systematic degradation of the very environment that supports it. The Ottomans were not malicious destroyers, they were simply distracted administrators, their gaze fixed on military glory and fiscal extraction, blind to the slow-motion collapse happening at their feet. They remind us that the most dangerous form of environmental management is not active destruction, but passive neglect, the quiet, unassuming decision to always prioritize the short-term emergency over the long-term essential. By the time the Ottoman Empire finally dissolved in the early 20th century, it bequeathed to the modern states of Iraq and Syria a Tigris River ecosystem that was severely weakened, setting the stage for the even more complex challenges of the modern era. As the Ottoman Empire receded into history, a new and fundamentally different kind of power arrived on the banks of the Tigris, armed not with scimitars but with slide rules and blueprints. The early 20th century saw the rise of the British Empire's influence in Mesopotamia, and with it came a modern, industrial age philosophy toward the ancient river. British colonial administrators and engineers looked upon the silted canals and neglected fields and saw not a complex historical relationship between people and environment, but a problem of inefficiency waiting for a technological solution. Their approach was characterized by a profound confidence in Western engineering and a desire to reshape the land to serve the economic needs of the empire. This led to an ambitious wave of public works, most notably the construction of large-scale, modern dams and barrages. These were not the simple earthen barriers of antiquity. They were formidable structures of concrete and steel, designed to impose a new, rigid order on the river's flow. The stated goal was noble: to control the Tigris's notorious flooding once and for all, to expand irrigable land, and to boost agricultural productivity. In the short term, these projects delivered on some of these promises, reclaiming land from seasonal swamps and providing a more reliable water supply for certain regions. But this top-down, technologically driven intervention, conceived in distant government offices in London and Delhi, failed to account for the intricate social and ecological tapestry it was disrupting. The consequences of this external imposition were felt most acutely at the local level, where centuries-old traditional water-sharing practices were suddenly overwritten by imperial decree. For generations, communities along the Tigris had managed their water through a complex system of customary rights and communal agreements, often mediated by local elders. This system, while not perfect, was adaptive and deeply informed by a granular understanding of the local microclimates, soil types, and seasonal variations. The British administration, in its drive for efficiency and centralized control, replaced this nuanced, localized governance with a standardized, bureaucratic system. Water was now allocated based on new maps and quotas designed to maximize export production, not community sustenance. This abruptly severed the deep connection between the farmers and their water source, transforming it from a shared, communal resource into an administered commodity. The result was widespread social conflict. Downstream communities that had relied on certain water flows for generations found themselves starved by upstream diversions authorized by the new colonial government. The technological solution had, in effect, solved the problem of distribution on paper while creating a crisis of equity and social trust on the ground, sowing seeds of resentment that would long outlast the colonial period. Furthermore, the British vision for the Tigris Basin was overwhelmingly economic, focused on transforming the region into a productive engine for the empire. This meant a decisive shift away from the diverse, subsistence-oriented agriculture that had sustained local populations for millennia and toward the intensive cultivation of cash crops, primarily cotton. The empire's textile mills in Manchester and Birmingham had an insatiable appetite for raw materials, and Mesopotamian cotton was to help feed it. Vast new irrigation schemes were designed specifically to support this single, thirsty crop. Cotton farming requires enormous quantities of water, far more than the traditional wheat and barley rotations used by local farmers. This policy led to a massive overuse of the Tigris's water, drawing down the resource at an unsustainable rate. But the damage went even deeper than simple depletion. The combination of intensive irrigation for cotton and the poor drainage inherent in many of the new canal systems dramatically accelerated the ancient curse of soil salinization. Waterlogged fields evaporated under the hot sun, drawing salts to the surface and creating great white, barren crusts where fertile land had once been. In their pursuit of short-term economic gain, the colonial authorities had inadvertently recreated the very environmental disaster that had helped doom the Sumerians thousands of years earlier, proving that technological power does not automatically confer wisdom. This colonial legacy did not vanish with the end of the British Mandate and the emergence of the modern state of Iraq. Instead, it set a powerful and problematic precedent. The British era established a template for water management that prioritized large-scale, centralized technological projects over adaptive, local knowledge. It entrenched a system of water allocation that was often divisive and that treated the river primarily as an economic utility rather than a holistic life support system. The dams and canals they built physically altered the river's hydrology in ways that are still being managed today. Perhaps most significantly, the political borders drawn by colonial powers like Britain and France cut across the natural watershed of the Tigris-Euphrates basin, placing the source of the river in one country, Turkey, its major tributaries in another, Syria, and its primary user in a third, Iraq. This created the perfect recipe for 21st century water disputes, as each nation now pursues its own dam building and irrigation projects upstream, with little regard for the dire consequences felt by those downstream. The British intervention illustrates a timeless and critical lesson that well-intentioned modernization, when applied without deep local knowledge and without respect for the social and ecological systems it disrupts, rarely solves old problems. Instead, it tends to layer new, more complex, and often more dangerous problems on top of them, creating a legacy of conflict that can flow through generations. The 20th century unleashed a new kind of force upon the ancient Tigris, one not of nature, but of reinforced concrete and geopolitical ambition. This was the era of the Megadam, where the age-old human desire to control the river was supercharged with 20th century technology and nationalistic fervor. Across the basin, from the Turkish highlands to the Iraqi plains, governments embarked on monumental engineering projects, viewing the river not just as a resource, but as a tool for modernization and national power. The Mosul Dam in Iraq, built in the 1980s with assistance from European firms, stood as a towering symbol of this new philosophy. Its objectives were undeniably modern and, on the surface, profoundly beneficial: to finally tame the Tigris's destructive flood cycles, to provide a massive and reliable reservoir for irrigation to feed a growing population, and to generate hydroelectric power that would light up cities and fuel industries. For a time, it seemed like the ultimate triumph of human ingenuity over nature's whims. the culmination of 3,000 years of struggle finally achieved with cement and turbine. Yet, this hard-won control came with a cascade of unintended consequences that rippled through the entire river ecosystem. The very act of damming the Tigris fundamentally altered its biological and geological heartbeat. A river is not merely a channel for water, it is a complex system that transports nutrients, sediments, and life. The great reservoirs behind dams like Mosul acted as massive settling ponds. The silt that for millennia had been carried downstream, the same rich sediment that had renewed the fertility of the Mesopotamian plains and built the delta, was now trapped behind concrete walls, sinking to the bottom of the artificial lake. Downstream of the dam, the water that flowed was therefore hungry, starved of its natural sediment load. This clearer water, possessing more erosive energy, began to scour the riverbed and banks downstream, undermining foundations and dramatically increasing the salinity of the water as it leached more salts from the now exposed riverbed. Furthermore, the regulated, artificial flow released from the dam lacked the natural seasonal variations that freshwater ecosystems had evolved to depend upon. The gentle pulses and fierce floods that once triggered fish spawning, cleansed waterways, and replenished wetlands were replaced by a monotonous, engineered trickle, leading to a steep decline in the river's biodiversity and the degradation of the historic marshlands in the south. Perhaps the most immediate and human cost of this new era of control was the displacement of communities. The creation of a massive reservoir meant the deliberate flooding of vast tracts of land that was often home to ancient villages, fertile farms, and sites of immense archaeological significance. Thousands of people were forcibly relocated, their ancestral homes and livelihoods submerged beneath the rising waters, their cultural connection to the river severed in the name of national progress. This pattern repeated itself with dam projects throughout the basin, creating a new class of environmental refugees and sowing deep-seated social resentment. The promised benefits of electricity and irrigation water often flowed to urban centers and industrial zones, while the rural communities who paid the highest price saw little in return, creating a stark divide between the beneficiaries of modernization and its casualties. This physical transformation of the river was dramatically compounded by a parallel political shift that turned water into a weapon and a source of international discord. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the subsequent drawing of modern borders by colonial powers created a fraught new reality. The Tigris was no longer a shared resource within a single empire. Its headwaters now originated in the newly defined nation of Turkey. Its major tributaries flowed through Syria, and its primary user was the downstream state of Iraq. This geographic reality set the stage for a zero-sum game over water rights. Turkey, asserting its national sovereignty, launched the most ambitious hydraulic project of all, the Southeastern Anatolia Project, known by its Turkish acronym GAP. This mammoth initiative envisioned 22 dams and 19 hydroelectric plants on the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, designed to transform Turkey's arid southeast into an agricultural and economic powerhouse. For Turkey, GAP was a matter of national development and regional pride. For Syria and Iraq, however, it was an existential threat. The filling of the massive Ataturk Dam reservoir on the Euphrates in 1990 brought relations to a boiling point. Turkey unilaterally cut the river's flow to Syria for a month to fill the reservoir, demonstrating in no uncertain terms who held the keys to the tap. Downstream in Iraq, farmers watched their fields wither as water levels plummeted. The Tigris and Euphrates were no longer seen as givers of life, but as leverage in a high-stakes diplomatic standoff. Water scarcity, always a natural challenge, was now intensely politicized. transforming the river from a historical connector of peoples into a modern source of deep-seated tension and potential conflict. The 20th century's legacy for the Tigris is thus profoundly mixed, a story of awe-inspiring technological achievement forever shadowed by ecological disruption, social displacement, and the alarming realization that our greatest tools for control can also become the sharpest instruments of strife. And so the cycle continues, but now at a scale and speed that would be unimaginable to the ancient engineers who first tried to tame this river. The challenges facing the Tigris today are not entirely new. They are the same fundamental struggles with scarcity, salinity, and control that toppled empires, but they are now supercharged by the pressures of the modern world and the global phenomenon of climate change. The most immediate and visible crisis is one of sheer absence. The water is simply vanishing. At the river's source high in the Turkish Taurus Mountains, the winter snowpack, that natural reservoir which has fed the Tigris for millennia, is steadily diminishing. Rising global temperatures mean less precipitation falls as snow and more as rain, which runs off quickly rather than being stored and released gradually through the spring and summer melt. This crucial shift is starving the river at its origin, reducing the steady, reliable flow that downstream communities in Syria and Iraq absolutely depend on. Compounding this problem is the intense heat itself. In a region where summer temperatures routinely soar past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, evaporation rates from the river's surface and from the vast reservoirs behind modern dams are staggering. Billions of gallons of water are literally vanishing into the hot, dry air before they can ever reach a farmer's field or a city's water treatment plant. This combination of reduced input and increased loss has plunged the entire basin into a state of permanent water stress, turning what were once occasional droughts into a relentless, multi-year megadrought that shows no sign of abating. The human response to this scarcity, tragically, has often been to dig deeper and extract more, accelerating a dangerous feedback loop. Faced with dwindling river flow, farmers and municipalities have turned en masse to pumping groundwater from ancient aquifers deep beneath the Mesopotamian plain. This is a finite resource, a legacy of wetter epochs that is not being replenished at nearly the rate it is being consumed. The widespread adoption of powerful diesel and electric pumps has allowed for an unprecedented drain on these underground reserves. The result is a precipitously falling water table. Wells that once struck water at 100 feet must now be drilled to 300, then 400 feet, and in some places they are now running completely dry. This over-extraction creates a chain reaction of environmental damage. As the water table drops, the earth above it can subside, causing the ground to compact and sink, a phenomenon that can crack foundations, rupture pipelines, and permanently reduce the aquifer's future capacity to hold water. But an even more sinister consequence occurs near the coast. As the pressure from fresh groundwater diminishes, salt water from the Persian Gulf begins to push inland, infiltrating the aquifers and contaminating them with brine. This saltwater intrusion is a silent, creeping poison that can render an entire region's groundwater undrinkable and useless for irrigation for centuries to come. On the surface, the landscape itself is transforming, reverting to a state that predates the very invention of agriculture. The process of desertification is now visibly reclaiming land that has been continuously farmed for over 7,000 years. Fields that were once the envy of the world, the very cradle of civilization, are now cracking under the sun, their fine soils turning to dust and being carried away on the wind. Without sufficient water to sustain plant life, the delicate soil structure breaks down, losing its organic matter and its ability to retain any moisture that does fall. The land becomes barren and impermeable, so that when rare rains do come, they cause flash flooding and erosion rather than nourishment. This is not a slow geological process anymore. It is a rapid anthropogenic collapse. You can see its effects from space, great swaths of green that have turned a dull, uniform brown, shrinking year by year as the desert advances. The dust storms that blow out from these newly arid zones have become more frequent and more severe, carrying not just soil but also industrial pollutants and pesticide residues, creating respiratory health crises in cities like Baghdad and Basra, and blanketing the region in an apocalyptic orange haze. What makes this modern crisis so poignant is how starkly it mirrors the ancient struggles we have chronicled. The Sumerians battled salinization caused by their irrigation canals. Today, we fight the same enemy, now supercharged by modern dams that reduce silt flushing and by the intrusion of seawater. The Akkadian Empire likely collapsed under the weight of a megadrought. Today, we face a similar climatic shift, but one that is unequivocally amplified by global carbon emissions. The Assyrians' vast hydraulic network made them vulnerable to climate shifts. Our own colossal dam projects, while technologically magnificent, have created an even more rigid and brittle system, one that is struggling to adapt to a new hydrological reality. We have all the technology of the 21st century at our disposal: satellite imagery, computerized models, advanced materials, and yet we find ourselves trapped in the same elemental conflict with the river that defined the fate of Sargon, Hammurabi, and Sennacherib. Our tools are more powerful, but the fundamental equation remains unchanged. A civilization's longevity is determined by its ability to live within the sustainable limits of its environment. The current emergency on the banks of the Tigris is not just a regional water shortage. It is the latest chapter in a 3,000-year-old drama, and it serves as an urgent, real-world lesson that technological prowess alone cannot inoculate a society against the consequences of ecological overshoot. The river's modern struggle holds up a mirror to our global future, a stark warning of what happens when the balance between human need and natural capacity is broken. But the true tragedy of this environmental decline is not measured in falling water levels or rising salt concentrations alone. It is etched into the very fabric of life that depends on the river. The Tigris Basin is not merely a water source. It is a vast, interconnected web of ecosystems, a biodiversity hotspot that has nurtured unique species found nowhere else on Earth. The most spectacular of these was the vast network of Mesopotamian marshes in southern Iraq, a sprawling aquatic landscape of towering reeds, open lagoons, and intricate channels often hailed as the legendary Garden of Eden. This lush wetland was a haven for an astonishing array of life. It was the wintering ground for millions of migratory birds, a critical stopover on the Africa-Siberia flyway for species like the majestic marbled teal and the Basra reed warbler, a small bird that bears the name of its primary home. Beneath the water's surface thrived endemic fish like the Mesopotamian barbel and the unbranded saboteur, perfectly adapted to the marsh's unique conditions. This was a place where nature, culture, and history were inextricably woven together for over 5,000 years, sustained by the annual pulse of floodwaters from the Tigris and Euphrates. This ancient, delicate balance was shattered in a breathtakingly short period of time through a deliberate act of ecological warfare. Following the 1991 Gulf War, the regime of Saddam Hussein launched a devastating campaign to drain the marshes, viewing them as a refuge for political opponents. In a brutal feat of engineering, the regime constructed a massive network of canals, dikes, and drains to divert the life-giving waters of the Tigris and Euphrates away from the wetlands and straight to the Gulf. Giant earth-moving machines carved scars into the landscape, effectively turning off the tap for the entire ecosystem. The results were catastrophic and horrifyingly swift. Where there had once been a shimmering mosaic of water and reeds covering nearly 6,000 square miles, an area larger than Connecticut, a cracked, white desert of salt-encrusted earth quickly emerged. The lush green reed beds, some towering over 20 feet high, withered and died. The water buffalo that the local marsh Arab communities, known as the Megadam, had depended on for millennia perished or were sold. The intricate culture of the Megadam, who had built a way of life on floating islands and woven reed houses for centuries, was utterly dismantled, forcing an estimated 90% of the population to flee their ancestral homes. In less than a decade, an ecosystem that had persisted since the last ice age was brought to the brink of total annihilation, representing one of the most severe and rapid engineered environmental disasters of the 20th century. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming destruction, the story of the marshes offers a fragile seed of hope, a testament to nature's resilience when given even a sliver of a chance. After the fall of the Hussein regime in 2003, local communities, remembering the pathways of the old waters, began a desperate and grassroots effort to break down the dams and embankments that had starved their homeland. Using little more than shovels and determination, they breached the barriers, allowing the precious waters of the Tigris to begin trickling back into their parched and dying world. This local action sparked a larger international restoration movement, supported by the Iraqi government and international environmental organizations. The reflooding that followed was watched with bated breath by scientists worldwide. To their astonishment, life returned with a speed that defied all expectations. Reed shoots pushed through the dry ground, fish returned to newly filled channels, and birds began to appear again on the horizon. Today, about 70% of the marsh area has seen some degree of recovery, and the area was designated as Iraq's first national park and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its unique value to humanity. However, this recovery remains heartbreakingly precarious, hanging in the balance of forces far beyond the marshes themselves. The ancient rhythm of the Tigris's flood, which once reliably replenished these wetlands every spring, has now been silenced by the great dams upstream in Turkey and Iran. The water that does arrive is often polluted with agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and salinity from upstream irrigation, making it less suitable for the delicate reed beds and the life they support. The new threat of climate change-induced drought further strangles the inflow. The marsh Arabs who have returned face an uncertain future, their ability to sustain their traditional fishing and water buffalo herding lifestyles constantly challenged by the poor water quality and unpredictable quantity. The fate of the marshes now is a stark microcosm of the entire river's dilemma. Their survival is no longer a local issue. It is entirely dependent on international water policy, diplomatic agreements between neighboring countries, and global efforts to combat climate change. The story of this ecosystem is the most powerful proof that the health of a river is not a separate concern from human well-being. It is the very foundation of it. When we push a unique environment to the edge of extinction, we aren't just losing species. We are severing a lifeline for human communities, erasing millennia of cultural heritage, and dismantling a natural system that has provided food, water, and stability since the dawn of civilization. The struggle of the Mesopotamian marshes is an urgent reminder that biodiversity is not a luxury. It is the bedrock of our own survival. Beyond the rise and fall of empires and the relentless cycle of environmental change, the Tigris has carved its deepest mark not in clay or stone, but in the human spirit itself. For over 3,000 years, this river has been a boundless source of inspiration, a muse for storytellers, poets, and prophets, weaving its way through the very fabric of human imagination and identity. Its waters flow through our oldest stories, giving shape to our deepest fears and grandest aspirations. The most profound of these is the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature, composed in ancient Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. This epic tale of a proud king's quest for immortality is inextricably linked to the river. Gilgamesh's journey takes him across the waters of death, and the entire narrative is saturated with the presence of the Tigris and Euphrates. Crucially, the epic features a cataclysmic flood story, a divine deluge meant to wipe out humanity, which bears striking parallels to the later biblical narrative of Noah. This was not mere coincidence. It was the Tigris itself, with its own terrifying history of unpredictable, village-swallowing floods, that provided the raw, experiential material for these foundational myths. The river's power and caprice were so immense that they could only be explained as the work of gods, shaping early religious thought and giving humans a framework for understanding the uncontrollable forces of nature. This tradition of reverence continued for millennia, with the river featuring prominently in the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, forever enshrining it as a place of both historical and spiritual significance. This cultural legacy is not confined to ancient manuscripts or museum exhibits. It is a living, breathing presence along the river's banks today, a continuous thread connecting the modern world to its most ancient roots. In the southern marshlands of Iraq, you can still hear the distinctive dialect of the marsh Arabs, whose language retains words and phrases that scholars have traced back to the ancient Sumerian tongue. The graceful, arching wooden boats known as taradas, poled through the reed channels, are direct descendants of the reed crafts depicted on Sumerian cylinder seals. The cultivation of the date palm, a practice perfected by Babylonian agriculturists, remains a vital economic and cultural activity, with the sweet fruits from the Tigris Valley still prized across the region. The techniques for weaving reeds into mats and building materials have been passed down through countless generations, a skill that once built the houses of Uruk and now provides shelter and income for contemporary communities. These are not quaint tourist attractions or historical reenactments. They are resilient strands of cultural DNA that have survived conquest, neglect, and environmental catastrophe. They represent an unbroken chain of knowledge and tradition, a testament to the incredible endurance of human culture when it is intimately tied to a specific place and a specific way of life. Every date harvested, every boat built, every story told in that ancient accented dialect is an act of cultural preservation, a quiet defiance against the erasures of time. Yet, this fragile living heritage now faces a confluence of threats more dangerous than any single invading army. Rapid, often unplanned urbanization is swallowing up agricultural land and severing the connection between younger generations and the traditional practices of their ancestors. As people move to sprawling cities like Baghdad and Mosul in search of economic opportunity, the intimate knowledge of how to read the river's moods, how to maintain a palm grove, or how to weave reeds is not being passed on. Even more devastating has been the recent decades of relentless conflict, which have deliberately targeted cultural memory. Archaeological sites like Nineveh and Nimrud, the very heartland of Assyrian culture, have been damaged by fighting or deliberately vandalized by extremists seeking to erase the pre-Islamic past. Museums have been looted and ancient manuscripts have been lost forever. The constant state of instability makes the long-term, careful work of archaeological preservation and cultural documentation incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Furthermore, the environmental crisis we detailed earlier is also a cultural assassin. As the river shrinks and salinization increases, the date palms, which are highly sensitive to water quality and quantity, are dying off. The marshes, the unique environment that nurtured the distinct culture of the Madan people, are again drying out, threatening to finish the job of cultural destruction that began in the 1990s. The very ecosystem that gave birth to these traditions is now disappearing, taking the culture with it. This makes the urgent work of preservation about far more than just nostalgia for the past. It is about safeguarding a fundamental part of our collective human identity. The story of the Tigris civilizations is the story of humanity's first experiments with urban living, with law, with writing, with large-scale society. To lose the physical artifacts and the living traditions of this world is to lose a critical chapter in our own story, a chapter that explains how we got to where we are today. Organizations of local historians, archaeologists, and even dedicated communities are fighting an uphill battle to document everything from oral histories and traditional songs to ancient irrigation techniques before they vanish entirely. They understand that the Tigris is more than a river. It is a vast flowing library, and its banks are shelves holding the records of our shared journey. Its cultural legacy demonstrates that a civilization's true endurance is measured not only in the power of its armies or the height of its ziggurats, but in the resilience of its stories, its crafts, and its connection to the land that sustained it. The river's flow reminds us that while empires are temporary, the stories we tell and the traditions we keep can, against all odds, echo for millennia. If we could distill 3,000 years of history along the Tigris into a single, vital lesson, it would be this: the most brilliant human innovations are meaningless without the wisdom to see their long-term consequences. Every civilization we've encountered, from the Sumerians to the Sassanids, mastered the art of extracting abundance from the river. They were geniuses of short-term solution, brilliant tacticians in the immediate battle for survival and power. But without exception, they failed as long-term strategists. They solved the puzzle right in front of them, only to inadvertently create a far more complex and dangerous puzzle for their grandchildren to solve. This is the core of their legacy, not just their glorious achievements, but their profound blind spots, and it's a legacy that speaks directly to the challenges we face in our own time. The Sumerians provide the most classic and cautionary example of this pattern. Their invention of large-scale irrigation was a monumental leap forward, a technological miracle that literally built the first cities. But in their focus on controlling water for today's harvest, they missed the silent, creeping threat that arrived with it. They didn't understand the chemistry happening beneath their feet, that each time they flooded their fields under the hot sun, they were depositing a tiny, almost invisible layer of salt as the water evaporated. Year after year, season after season, this salt accumulated, slowly poisoning the very soil that fed them. Their clay tablets tell this tragic story in their own words, recording how their prized wheat fields gradually had to be replaced with more salt-tolerant barley, and then how even those yields began to dwindle. Their success contained the seeds of its own failure because they were managing for the immediate crop, not for the health of the land a century hence. They lacked the foresight to invest in solutions like drainage canals to flush the salts away, a fix that would have cost labor and resources in the short term for a payoff they might never see. This is the eternal tension between the urgent and the important, a tension every society must navigate. The Akkadian and Assyrian empires, for all their military might and engineering prowess, fell into a different but equally fatal trap, the trap of hyper-efficiency and centralization. They built incredible, complex systems, canals, aqueducts, and administrative networks that made their societies incredibly productive and powerful. But in creating these magnificent, interconnected machines, they also made them terrifyingly brittle. They eliminated redundancy and flexibility. The entire system was optimized to function perfectly under a specific set of conditions. When those conditions changed, as they inevitably did with a prolonged drought, the entire edifice had no backup plan, no plan B. There was no slack in the system, no alternative water sources to tap, no diverse range of crops that could withstand the new climate reality. Their efficiency became their greatest vulnerability. They had traded resilience for peak performance, and when the environment threw them a curveball, they had no capacity to adapt. They were rigid, and rigidity shatters under pressure. So what does a wiser path look like, if not the Sumerian path of unintended consequences or the Assyrian path of brittle control? The historical record suggests it lies in embracing adaptation and building flexibility directly into our systems. It means shifting from a mindset of domination over nature to one of collaboration with it. This isn't about abandoning technology, it's about applying it more intelligently. Instead of building ever higher dams to force the river into submission, it might mean creating controlled flood zones, areas designed to safely absorb and utilize floodwaters, replenishing aquifers and creating seasonal wetlands, much like the natural floodplain did before we channelized everything. It means valuing and preserving the natural buffers, like the Mesopotamian marshes, that historically acted as the river's kidneys, filtering water and absorbing floods, because we now understand that these ecosystems provide irreplaceable services that are far more costly to replicate with concrete and steel. Perhaps the most crucial lesson is the need for a long-term perspective that transcends political and generational cycles. The Sumerian farmer who chose not to dig a drainage canal was making a rational decision for his lifetime. He couldn't know it would cripple his great-grandchildren's farm. Today, we face the same myopia. Our political and economic systems are overwhelmingly geared toward short-term gains, the next election cycle, the next quarterly profit report. Investing in sustainable water management, in rebuilding soil health, or in preparing for climate shifts offers little immediate political or financial reward, yet the cost of inaction is catastrophic. The history of the Tigris screams at us to find a way to institutionalize long-term thinking, to create policies and economic incentives that reward stewardship and penalize the reckless depletion of resources. It's about learning to plant trees under whose shade we may never personally sit, but whose shade is essential for those who come after us. The river's story is ultimately a choice, one that every civilization must make. Do we exploit until there is nothing left, or do we learn to listen to the land and build a future that can last? Yet, even as we confront these immense challenges born from the past, a new wave of ingenuity is rising to meet them, not with the brute force of concrete alone, but with a smarter, more collaborative spirit. The same technological power that helped create some of the problems is now being harnessed to solve them, marking a profound shift from domination of the river to a more harmonious dialogue with it. High above the earth, a silent revolution in water management is taking place. Satellites equipped with advanced sensors now constantly monitor the Tigris basin, tracking snowpack depth in the Turkish highlands, measuring soil moisture levels across the plains of Iraq, and even detecting slight changes in the ground's elevation that can signal aquifer depletion. This real-time data provides an unprecedented, holistic view of the entire river system, allowing for a move from reactive crisis response to proactive prediction. Authorities can now model potential flood events with remarkable accuracy, issuing early warnings to downstream communities days before the waters rise, saving lives and livelihoods. This space-age technology offers a God's eye view that ancient diviners could never have imagined. transforming the river from a mysterious, capricious force into a system that can be understood and anticipated. On the ground, this smarter approach is reflected in the quiet efficiency of drip irrigation, a technology that feels almost like an apology to the Sumerian farmers who first struggled with salinity. Instead of flooding entire fields and losing vast quantities of water to evaporation and runoff, these systems deliver tiny, precise droplets of water directly to the base of each plant's roots through a network of tubes and emitters. The water savings are staggering, often 50 to 70% compared to traditional methods, dramatically reducing the amount of water extracted from the struggling river. But the benefits go even deeper. By keeping the soil around the roots moist but not waterlogged, drip irrigation dramatically slows the process of salinization. There is simply less excess water to evaporate and leave its toxic mineral residue behind. This is a beautiful example of a modern innovation that directly addresses an ancient problem, using subtlety and precision where previous generations could only apply overwhelming force. It's a recognition that the goal is not to conquer the land, but to nurture it with the minimum effective dose of its most precious resource. Perhaps the most difficult, yet most crucial, innovation is not technological but diplomatic. The zero-sum mindset that has often characterized water disputes between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq is gradually, painstakingly, giving way to a recognition of mutual interdependence. While far from perfect, agreements like the 1987 protocol between Turkey and Iraq, which promised a guaranteed minimum flow of water downstream, represent a critical first step toward shared management. The immense challenge, of course, is that a river does not respect political borders. It is a single, integrated system. True sustainability requires moving beyond rigid water quotas and toward integrated basin-wide management, where upstream dam releases are coordinated with downstream agricultural needs and ecological requirements. This means valuing the health of the entire river system, including the restoration of the Mesopotamian marshes, as a shared strategic priority for all nations involved. It requires building trust where little exists, and acknowledging that the security of one nation is ultimately tied to the water security of its neighbors. This kind of cooperation is the modern equivalent of Hammurabi's code, but on an international scale, a framework of understanding rather than laws, built not on stone, but on the fragile yet powerful foundation of shared need. Nowhere is this blending of ancient wisdom and modern science more beautifully illustrated than in the ongoing effort to restore the Mesopotamian marshes. This project is far more than an ecological vanity. It is a living laboratory for a new philosophy of water management. Scientists use hydrological models and satellite imagery to plan the precise breaching of dikes and the optimal pathways for reflooding, ensuring the water goes where it will do the most good. But they are guided by the intimate, generations-deep knowledge of the Madan people, the marsh Arabs who understand the intricate web of channels and the rhythms of the reeds better than any textbook ever could. Their traditional practices of sustainable fishing and reed harvesting are being documented and integrated into the management plan, ensuring the restored ecosystem supports both biodiversity and human community. This is a holistic approach that sees the river not just as a volume of H2O to be allocated, but as the heart of a complex cultural and ecological landscape. The return of the water has triggered a stunning ecological comeback, with birds, fish, and aquatic plants returning in numbers that have stunned biologists, proving that even ecosystems pushed to the very brink possess a powerful will to live if given a chance. These collective efforts, from orbiting satellites to community-led restoration, paint a picture of cautious optimism. they demonstrate a dawning awareness that our relationship with a great river must be a partnership, not a dictatorship. The modern approach is learning to listen to the river, to read its signals with our technology, and to respond with a mix of innovation and respect for the ancient balances that have always sustained life along its banks. This represents a fundamental shift from the engineering arrogance of the past toward a more humble, holistic stewardship. It acknowledges that we cannot simply command the Tigris, but we can learn to dance with it, anticipating its moves and adapting our own, ensuring the music of flowing water continues for generations to come. This deep-seated reliance on agriculture, consuming more than 80% of the Tigris's precious water, has locked the modern economies of Iraq and Syria into a precarious and vulnerable position, echoing the very same patterns that doomed their ancient predecessors. The entire social and economic fabric of the region is woven from this single, fragile thread. Millions of livelihoods are directly tied to the river's flow, from the smallholder farmer tending a date palm grove that has been in his family for generations, to the massive state-run wheat plantations that are crucial for national food security. This creates an economy with almost no shock absorbers. A single bad water year caused by an upstream dam reduction in Turkey or a prolonged drought doesn't just mean lower profits, it can trigger a cascade of disaster. Crop failures lead to soaring food prices, which spark social unrest. Lost harvests mean farmers cannot repay loans, crippling local banks. Rural unemployment skyrockets, driving a desperate migration into already overcrowded cities like Baghdad and Mosul, where they strain social services and increase political instability. The economy is, in effect, a monoculture not just in its crops, but in its fundamental dependency on a resource that is proving to be increasingly unreliable. This isn't just an economic model, it's a high-wire act performed without a net where the river's flow is the only thing preventing a fall. Compounding this ancient vulnerability is a modern and equally thirsty industry, oil. In regions like Kirkuk, the ground doesn't just yield water, it yields black gold, but the extraction of this immense wealth comes with a hidden and steep water cost. The oil industry is notoriously water-intensive, requiring vast quantities for drilling, for maintaining pressure in oil fields, and for cleaning equipment. This often means drilling deep new wells to access groundwater, directly competing with farmers for the same dwindling aquifers. Furthermore, the process creates devastating pollution. Leaks, spills, and the improper disposal of toxic produced water, a briny, chemical-laden byproduct of extraction, can poison nearby rivers and seep into groundwater, rendering entire aquifers unusable for decades. This creates a cruel paradox for the region. The oil wealth that funds government budgets and infrastructure projects is simultaneously undermining the agricultural sector that feeds the population and employs a huge portion of the workforce. A nation can perhaps survive without exporting more oil, but it cannot survive without food and clean water. The pursuit of one form of wealth is actively sabotaging the foundation of another, more essential one, creating a dangerous internal conflict over resources that pits the engine of the modern economy against the ancient foundation of life itself. The tragic irony is that this precarious situation is not a new story. It is a haunting echo of history repeating itself on a grander, more dangerous scale. The Akkadian Empire's economy was entirely dependent on barley and wheat from irrigated fields. When the drought hit, that single point of failure brought the entire imperial system down. The Assyrians centralized their agricultural production to feed Nineveh, and when the water systems failed, the empire shattered. Today, the players have changed and the technology has advanced, but the underlying structural vulnerability remains identical. Modern societies have simply swapped the imperial granary for the national breadbasket and the royal irrigation overseer for the Ministry of Agriculture. But the core principle is the same, a hyper-specialized economy tied inextricably to the river's whim. We have not learned the fundamental lesson of diversification. Instead, we have doubled down on the same risky bet, layering the volatile global oil market on top of the volatile water supply, creating a system with multiple single points of failure. The ghosts of ancient empires stand as a silent warning that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, an economy built on a fragile ecological foundation is an economy living on borrowed time. Breaking free from this 3,000-year cycle requires a conscious and difficult shift away from this entrenched dependency. The path toward greater stability lies in economic diversification and a wholesale adoption of sustainable practices. This means investing in sectors that are not water-intensive, such as technology, renewable energy, and education, creating new employment avenues that are not hostage to the next drought or the next political decision made in a distant capital. For the agricultural sector itself, which will always remain vital, the future must be one of doing more with far, far less. This involves a nationwide push toward drip irrigation, the development of drought-resistant crop varieties, and the use of satellite data for precision agriculture that delivers water only where and when it is needed. It means valuing water not as a free public good, but as the scarce and precious resource it truly is, implementing pricing and conservation policies that encourage its efficient use. This transition is not just an environmental imperative, it is the ultimate act of economic prudence. It is about building resilience into the very heart of the economy, creating multiple buffers and backup systems so that a shock to one sector does not bring the entire national system to its knees. It is the difference between building a house on the river's ever-shifting bank and building it on stable, high ground with a deep well and a stocked pantry, ready to weather any storm the future may bring. This immense challenge, where the fate of millions depends on the flow of a single river that crosses multiple borders, brings us to one of the most critical and difficult issues of our time, the absolute necessity of international cooperation. The water that flows from the Turkish highlands doesn't recognize the political lines we've drawn on maps. It is a shared resource in the truest sense, meaning that the actions of one nation inevitably ripple downstream, affecting everyone in its path. This geographic reality makes collaboration not a matter of altruism, but one of sheer practicality and survival. The most prominent effort to formalize this shared need is the 1987 protocol between Turkey and Iraq, a landmark agreement where Turkey committed to guaranteeing a specific minimum flow of water across its border into Iraq. On paper, this was a tremendous step forward, a recognition that the Tigris could not be treated as a national possession to be hoarded, but as a regional lifeline to be managed collectively. It represented a flicker of hope, a framework for turning potential conflict into a conversation. Yet the harsh reality on the ground has often fallen short of the promises made in diplomatic meeting rooms. The protocol, while groundbreaking, lacks the teeth of a fully binding treaty and is often overshadowed by the much larger and more controversial Southeastern Anatolia project, the GAP system of dams in Turkey. When Turkey needs to fill the vast reservoir behind its massive Ilisu Dam, it can single-handedly reduce the Tigris to a trickle for weeks, effectively holding the water hostage to its own national energy and agricultural needs. This creates a constant underlying tension where downstream communities in Iraq and Syria are left in a state of anxious vulnerability, their farms and cities held ransom to decisions made in a distant capital. Political disputes that have nothing to do with water, historical grievances, regional rivalries, security concerns routinely poison the well of diplomacy, making it nearly impossible to discuss the river's management in good faith. A disagreement over trade or a cross-border security incident can instantly derail years of painstaking technical negotiations between water ministers. The river becomes a pawn in a much larger game, and the people who depend on it are the ones who ultimately lose. In this fraught environment, international organizations like the United Nations strive to act as neutral facilitators, providing a platform for dialogue and technical expertise. They can bring hydrologists and engineers from all three nations together to share data and model future scenarios, creating a foundation of factual, apolitical understanding. But these efforts consistently bump up against the hard limits of national sovereignty. No country wants to cede control over a resource as vital as water to an outside body, no matter how well-intentioned. The UN can encourage, suggest, and warn, but it cannot force a nation to release water from its dams. Lasting solutions, therefore, cannot be imposed from the outside. They must be built from within, forged from a genuine, shared commitment to a sustainable future for the entire basin. This requires a level of trust that is currently in desperately short supply. Trust that upstream neighbors will not weaponize the water during a dispute, and trust that downstream partners will use the water responsibly and not waste it. Building this trust is the slow, unglamorous work of relationship building, constant communication, and demonstrable good faith that often gets lost in the headlines of conflict. We can actually find a powerful blueprint for this kind of successful cooperation not in modern treaties, but deep in the region's own history. During the Islamic Golden Age under the Abbasid Caliphate, the Tigris and Euphrates basins were largely united under a single political and administrative system. This allowed for a truly integrated approach to water management. Engineers and administrators operated with a regional vision, maintaining canals and irrigation networks from the headwaters to the delta for the benefit of the entire realm. Water was managed as a single, interconnected system, not as a collection of competing national assets. The result was the legendary prosperity of Baghdad and the cultural flourishing that defined the era. They flourished because they cooperated. In stark contrast, periods of fragmentation and conflict, like the destructive Mongol invasions, saw that cooperative system deliberately targeted and shattered, leading to centuries of decline for everyone involved. History offers a clear and compelling lesson. Shared water requires shared responsibility. When the nations of the Tigris Basin have found ways to work together, they have all prospered. When they have turned inward and prioritized their own short-term gain, the entire region has suffered together. This historical lesson underscores the profound importance of diplomacy today, but it must be a new kind of diplomacy, one that looks beyond simple water quotas. The old model of dividing the river like a pie, where one nation's gain is inherently another's loss, is a recipe for perpetual conflict. The future lies in moving toward integrated basin-wide management, a holistic approach that considers the entire river as a single, living entity. This means upstream and downstream nations working together on projects that benefit everyone, jointly managing dams to optimize flow for both power generation and agriculture downstream, collaborating on massive projects to modernize irrigation infrastructure across all three countries to reduce waste, and even creating a transparent, shared system of satellite monitoring so that everyone working from the same undeniable data. It means valuing the health of the entire ecosystem, from the Turkish highlands to the Iraqi marshes, as a shared strategic priority. The path forward is difficult, fraught with political landmines and decades of mistrust, but the alternative, a future of escalating water wars, economic collapse, and environmental ruin, is simply unthinkable. The river does not see borders. Our solutions must become just as boundless. Looking ahead, the future of the Tigris is not written in stone, but in the stark and sobering projections of climate models. Scientists analyzing the river's basin have reached a startling and deeply concerning conclusion. By the year 2050, the Tigris could lose as much as half of its historic flow. This isn't a distant, abstract possibility. It is a forecast grounded in the observable trends we see today. The primary driver is the rapid warming of the planet, which is fundamentally altering the river's life cycle at its source. The mountain snowpack in eastern Turkey, that natural frozen reservoir that has reliably fed the Tigris for millennia, is steadily shrinking. Warmer winters mean more precipitation falls as rain, which runs off immediately, rather than as snow that melts gradually through the spring and summer, providing a sustained, life-giving release. Compounding this, higher temperatures dramatically increase evaporation rates from the river's surface and from the vast reservoirs behind the region's many dams. Essentially, the river is being starved at its source and then baked under an intensifying sun, a 1-2 punch that threatens to squeeze it dry. The human consequences of such a drastic reduction are almost too vast to comprehend. We are talking about a direct and immediate threat to food security for millions of people across Iraq and Syria. The agricultural sector, which consumes the overwhelming majority of the river's water, would face catastrophic shortfalls. The iconic date palm orchards, a cultural and economic cornerstone for thousands of years, would wither and die. The vast wheat fields that helped feed the nation would turn to dust. This agricultural collapse would not simply mean higher food prices at the market. It would trigger a full-scale humanitarian crisis, sparking social unrest and creating desperate populations with nothing left to lose. History shows us that when people can no longer feed their families from the land they have always called home, they move. This scenario sets the stage for a massive wave of climate refugees, not across international borders initially, but from the rural countryside into already overcrowded and resource-stressed cities like Baghdad and Mosul, overwhelming infrastructure and creating tinderboxes of social and political tension. The river's decline, therefore, is not just an environmental issue. It is a potent threat multiplier for instability and conflict throughout the entire region. Confronting this daunting future forces upon us a critical choice, a choice that echoes the one faced by every civilization that has come before us along these banks. Will we repeat the classic, tragic mistakes of history, responding with short-sighted, brute force solutions that ultimately make the problem worse? The temptation will be strong to simply build bigger dams upstream, hoarding the dwindling water for oneself and sparking a destructive, zero-sum water war with neighboring countries. We could double down on our current agricultural practices, drilling deeper and deeper into ancient aquifers in a frantic race to the bottom that will only accelerate the coming crisis. This is the path of the Assyrians and the Sumerians, the path of rigidity and control, which leads only to a brittle and catastrophic failure when the environment inevitably shifts. Alternatively, we can choose the path of innovation and adaptation, finally learning the deep lessons this river has been trying to teach us for 3,000 years. This path requires a fundamental shift in mindset, from trying to dominate the river to learning to work in harmony with its new reality. Adaptation strategies are no longer a luxury, they are an absolute necessity for survival. This means a revolutionary change in agriculture, moving away from water-thirsty crops like wheat and cotton, and toward the development and widespread adoption of drought-resistant and salt-tolerant varieties that can thrive with a fraction of the water. It means a national crusade to replace flood irrigation with ultra-efficient drip and sprinkler systems, effectively placing the river on a life support system to maximize every single precious drop. Beyond the fields, it means investing in modernizing urban water infrastructure to fix the massive leaks that lose billions of gallons of treated water every year, and exploring large-scale projects for recycling wastewater for agricultural and industrial use. Perhaps the most profound adaptation involves rethinking our very relationship with the river's flow. Instead of seeing floods only as a threat to be contained with higher walls, we could learn to capture and store these occasional surges in massive underground aquifer storage and recovery systems, banking the water for the long, dry seasons instead of futilely trying to fight the water's natural power. This approach blends ancient wisdom, the value of saving for a leaner time, with cutting-edge hydrological science. The future of the Tigris and the civilizations that depend on it hinges entirely on our collective response. Will we be like the ancients, whose grand creations ultimately made them more vulnerable? Or will we finally demonstrate that we have learned from their struggles, choosing resilience over dominance, cooperation over conflict, and wisdom over power? The river's next chapter is waiting to be written, and the pen is in our hands. To truly understand the weight of this history, we must move beyond the grand sweep of empires and statistics and listen to the voices of those who live along the river's banks today. Their daily struggles and quiet resilience paint a human portrait of the environmental crisis, giving a face to the abstract concepts of water scarcity and climate change. Consider a man like Ahmed, a date farmer whose family has worked the same land on the outskirts of Baghdad for generations. His life is a testament to the river's enduring rhythm, but that rhythm is now faltering. He can point to the towering date palms his great-grandfather planted, trees that have always provided a reliable harvest and a sense of identity. But now he watches with a sinking heart as the irrigation canal that feeds his grove runs lower each year, its bed often cracked and dry under the relentless sun. The water that does arrive is increasingly saline, leaving a white, toxic crust on the soil that stunts the growth of his trees. For Ahmed, this isn't a political debate or a scientific report. It is the very real prospect of losing not just his income, but his heritage. The difficult choice to abandon the land that has defined his family for centuries is no longer a distant possibility, but a terrifyingly near reality. His story is echoed by thousands of other farmers across the region, each one a living link to the ancient agricultural traditions that first blossomed here, now facing the painful severing of that bond. Meanwhile, in the south, the struggle takes on a different but equally profound cultural dimension. The marsh Arab communities, the Megadam, who have returned to the re-flooded marshes, are fighting to reclaim a way of life that was almost erased. An elder named Yusuf, born in a house built of woven reeds, speaks of the joy he felt seeing the water return after the fall of the previous regime, of hearing the familiar sound of boat traffic through the channels once more. But that joy is tempered by a new anxiety. The water is often too salty and too polluted to support the robust reed growth needed to maintain their traditional homes and crafts. The buffalo herds, central to their economy and diet, are sickly, producing less milk due to the poor water quality. For Yusuf, the challenge is not just economic survival, but the preservation of a unique culture, a language, and a relationship with the environment that dates back to the time of the Sumerians. His community's resilience is a powerful symbol of hope, but it is a fragile hope dependent on a river whose health is determined by powers far beyond their control, in distant capitals and upstream dams. Alongside these guardians of traditional life are the modern-day sentinels of the past, archaeologists and conservationists engaged in a desperate race against time. Dr. Layla Hassan, an Iraqi archaeologist, spends her days at sites that are crumbling before her eyes. She explains how the very river that gave life to the world's first cities is now taking them back. Reduced water flow and falling water tables are causing the waterlogged soil that has preserved ancient mud brick structures for millennia to dry out. As this soil contracts and cracks, it exposes fragile walls and foundations to the elements, leading to their rapid erosion and collapse. Even more dramatic are the increasing episodes of intense, unpredictable flooding. A single violent storm can unleash torrents that gouge away entire sections of an unexcavated mound, washing away irreplaceable artifacts and context forever. For researchers like Dr. Hassan, each season brings the heartbreak of watching a priceless page of human history literally dissolve into the river. Their work has shifted from pure discovery to emergency triage, a frantic effort to document and protect what they can before it vanishes, a stark reminder that the loss is not just environmental but deeply cultural, erasing the physical evidence of our collective origins. These personal stories, from Ahmed's Grove to Yusuf's marshes to Dr. Hassan's dig site, weave together to form a single, powerful narrative. They transform the abstract notion of climate change impact into something immediate and deeply human. We are not watching statistics on a chart. We are witnessing the unraveling of lives, livelihoods, and legacies that have been intertwined with the Tigris for thousands of years. This connection makes the river's plight our own. Their struggles with water scarcity, salinity, and erosion are not isolated problems in a far-off land. They are a preview of the challenges that a warming, water-stressed world may face more broadly. Their resilience, the farmer experimenting with drip irrigation, the marsh community adapting its practices, the archaeologist innovating new preservation techniques, becomes a source of inspiration and a crucial blueprint for adaptation. Their daily lives underscore the most urgent lesson of all, that the story of the Tigris is not yet over. The choices we make now, from international water treaties to global climate policy, will directly determine whether these communities can endure and whether their ancient connection to the river will flow on for generations to come, or simply become another layer of silt in the river's long and layered history. While the written records of ancient empires provide one kind of truth, the silent testimony of the earth itself often tells a deeper, more visceral story. Archaeology acts as our time machine, allowing us to peel back the layers of silt and sand to uncover the physical evidence of how civilizations along the Tigris truly lived, adapted, and ultimately fell. Recent discoveries are radically reshaping our understanding, pushing the origins of complex society further back in time and revealing a much more intimate dance between humanity and the river's power. Perhaps no site has done more to revolutionize this narrative than Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, not far from the headwaters of the Tigris. This staggering complex of massive, T-shaped stone pillars arranged in circles was carved by hunter-gatherers around 11,600 years ago, a staggering 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza. For decades, the accepted theory was that agriculture came first. The steady food supply of farming allowed for surplus, which then enabled people to settle down and develop complex religion and society. Göbekli Tepe turns that idea completely on its head. Here we have evidence of a grand communal project of spiritual significance that predates settled farming. This suggests that it was the urge to come together for ritual and worship that may have actually catalyzed the shift to agriculture. People needed to feed the large groups gathering at this sacred site, which may have provided the impetus to domesticate wild grains and animals from the surrounding region, a region that would eventually be nourished by the Tigris. This means the very origins of the farming revolution that gave rise to Mesopotamia's first cities might be deeply connected to the cultural forces that gathered near this river's source, showing that the human story here is even older and more complex than we ever imagined. As we move downstream and forward in time, archaeologists are using ever more sophisticated tools to read the river's own history book, the layers of soil and sediment deposited over millennia. By drilling deep cores into the mud of the Tigris floodplain or from the bottom of the Persian Gulf, scientists can extract a vertical timeline of environmental change. These mud cores act like a climate fingerprint. Within them, scientists analyze the types of pollen trapped within different layers. A sudden shift from oak tree pollen to dry scrub brush pollen can indicate the onset of a drought. They examine the microscopic shells of plankton that can reveal the salinity and temperature of the water. Most tellingly, they look at the size of the sediment grains. Layers of fine, silty clay indicate long periods of slow, gentle deposition from a well-behaved river. But then, you might hit a distinct layer of much larger, coarse gravel and sand. This is the unmistakable signature of a catastrophic flood event, a sudden, violent deluge powerful enough to carry and deposit large stones. By carbon dating organic material found just above and below these coarse layers, researchers can pinpoint exactly when these mega floods occurred. This paleoclimatology has provided stunning corroboration of historical texts. For instance, sediment cores from around the time of the Akkadian Empire's collapse show a dramatic increase in aridity and wind-blown dust, perfectly aligning with the theory of a devastating mega-drought that crippled their agriculture. The river's own geological record is confirming the stories of empire-ending climate disasters, moving them from the realm of legend into the realm of scientific fact. Some of the most dramatic evidence of the Tigris's destructive power isn't buried underground, but lies hidden beneath its own waters. In recent years, periods of drought and strategic dam drainage have occasionally lowered the river's level enough to reveal the ghosts of cities long lost. Submerged walls, foundations, and even entire streets have emerged from the depths, offering a tantalizing glimpse of settlements swallowed by the river's changing course or a sudden, catastrophic flood. Underwater archaeology in the Tigris is notoriously difficult due to strong currents and poor visibility, but the potential rewards are immense. The discovery of these sunken cities provides direct physical proof of the river's volatility. We can see how a city was laid out in relation to the water, study the engineering of its fortifications against floods, and sometimes find the very layer of silt that entombed it. These sites are literal time capsules, frozen in the moment of their inundation. They offer irrefutable evidence that the great flood myths, like the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, were not mere fables but likely rooted in collective memory of real, traumatic events that scoured the river valley, wiping entire communities off the map and leaving a lasting psychological scar on the survivors that was passed down through generations as a warning from the gods. Beyond climate and catastrophe, archaeology provides an intimate look at the daily triumphs and failures of the people who tried to manage the Tigris. The most telling finds are often the most humble. The analysis of ancient soil samples from long-abandoned fields reveals the tragic, rising salt content that slowly choked the life out of Sumerian barley harvests. The excavated skeletons from periods of collapse often show signs of malnutrition and stunted growth, a silent testament to the famines that followed failed rains. Conversely, the unearthed ruins of the Abbasid periods, elaborate water wheels and canal systems speak to a golden age of hydraulic engineering and prosperity. Each broken pottery shard, each preserved seed, each set of bones adds a pixel to the larger picture. This granular evidence allows us to move beyond the boasts of kings inscribed on monuments and understand the real-life experience of the common farmer, the merchant, and the city dweller whose survival was dictated by the river's mood. We can trace the evolution of technology, from the first simple irrigation ditches to the Assyrians' monumental aqueducts, and see the corresponding increase in societal complexity and vulnerability. Archaeology gives us the tools to deconstruct the cycle of civilization itself, showing how each adaptation to control the river created a new dependency, and how each period of abundance sowed the seeds for a potential future collapse. This makes the work of modern archaeologists a race against time, and not just against the natural decay of centuries. The very same forces that threaten the modern region also threaten to erase its past. Looting, born from economic desperation and political instability, has ravaged countless sites, with artifacts ripped from their context and sold on the black market, forever severing their connection to the story they could tell. Furthermore, the current climate crisis poses a direct threat. Increased salinization from falling water tables and rising sea levels is chemically eating away at exposed mud brick ruins, causing them to crumble into dust. More frequent and intense droughts are causing the soil to contract and crack, undermining ancient foundations. And when the rains do come, they are often torrential, causing severe erosion that can wash away entire layers of an unexcavated settlement in a single season. Each site lost is a chapter torn from the history book of humanity, a lost opportunity to learn from the past. The ongoing work to preserve these sites and decipher their secrets is not an academic luxury. It is an urgent mission to retrieve an operating manual for survival in a river valley. By understanding precisely how the Akkadians organized their grain storage, how the Babylonians settled water disputes, or how the Assyrians designed their canals, we gain a repository of tested ideas, both brilliant and flawed, for managing water scarcity, environmental stress, and social conflict. The Tigris's past, painstakingly unearthed by archaeologists, offers a priceless legacy of wisdom, providing crucial data points for building a more resilient future on its banks, proving that the most important tool for navigating what comes next may very well be a careful study of what has already been. But the power of these ancient stories did not fade with the cuneiform tablets they were written on. Instead, they flowed forward through time, merging with other traditions and evolving to speak to new generations. The most profound example of this is the undeniable echo of the Gilgamesh flood myth that resonates in the later biblical story of Noah's Ark. The parallels are too striking to be mere coincidence. A divine decision to wipe out humanity with a flood, the warning given to a righteous man, the instruction to build a great boat to save his family and the seeds of all life, the boat coming to rest on a mountain as the waters recede, and the sending out of birds to find dry land. This is not a case of one story copying another, but rather a powerful demonstration of how a foundational cultural memory, born from the very real and terrifying experience of Tigris floods, traveled through trade routes and cultural exchange, being adapted and adopted into the sacred texts of another people. The story was so potent, so deeply embedded in the human psyche of the region, that it became a universal archetype for divine judgment and salvation. It shows us that the Tigris was not just a local phenomenon. Its influence through the stories it inspired shaped the spiritual imagination of the entire Western world, proving that a river's current can carry ideas as powerfully as it carries silt. This deep, mythical connection transformed the physical river into a sacred geography, a place where heaven and earth were believed to meet. In ancient times, the Tigris wasn't just a body of water. It was a divine entity, a god to be worshipped and appeased. The Assyrians and Babylonians personified the river as a powerful deity in their pantheons, often associated with the god of wisdom and fresh water, E or Enki. To divert its water through a canal was not just an engineering project, it was a religious act that required rituals, prayers, and offerings to ensure the god's favor. This worldview fostered a sense of reverence, a recognition that the river was a conscious force with its own will, a force that could be petitioned but never truly controlled. This perspective, while born from a pre-scientific understanding of the world, encoded a crucial ecological wisdom, that humanity exists in a relationship with nature, not in a position of dominance over it. The river's favor had to be earned through respect and proper conduct. This stands in stark contrast to our modern, often purely utilitarian view of rivers as industrial resources to be dammed, diverted, and drained. The ancients, through their myths, understood something we are only now painfully relearning, that a river has a life of its own, and that ignoring its essential nature invites catastrophe. This rich tapestry of legend continued to weave itself through the centuries, finding vibrant new expression during the Islamic Golden Age, as Baghdad flourished into the world's greatest center of learning and culture. The Tigris became a central muse for poets and scholars. It flowed through the verses of famed poets like Al-Mutanabbi, who used its currents as metaphors for the flow of time, fate, and divine wisdom. In the iconic tales of the 1001 Nights, the river is the backdrop for adventure and romance, a liquid highway upon which the fate of heroes and lovers often turns. It is the route Scheherazade's characters travel, the source of a city's wealth, and a silent witness to countless dramas. This literary celebration elevated the Tigris from a mere geographical feature to a symbol of life itself, constant yet changing, nourishing yet perilous, a source of endless inspiration and mystery. The river was woven into the very identity of the culture, a symbol of the Abbasid Empire's brilliance and the enduring spirit of its people. Its presence in these stories cemented its place not just in the landscape, but in the very soul of the civilization it sustained. In our modern era, the river's symbolic power has undergone another transformation, shifting from a source of divine wonder and romantic adventure to a potent symbol of loss, nostalgia, and resilience. For contemporary Iraqi writers and artists, particularly those who have lived through decades of war, sanctions, and environmental decay, the Tigris has become a heartbreaking metaphor for their fractured homeland. In novels and poems, its polluted and diminished flow mirrors the suffering of the people, its waters holding the memory of a glorious past that stands in sharp contrast to a challenging present. It is a symbol of what has been lost, not just water, but a way of life, a cultural continuity, and a sense of belonging. Yet, even in this, there is a thread of hope. The river's enduring presence, its stubborn continued flow despite everything, also makes it a powerful symbol of survival. The ongoing efforts to restore the Mesopotamian marshes, for instance, are not just ecological projects. They are acts of cultural defiance, a reclaiming of identity rooted in the ancient stories of the land. The modern myths we are creating about the Tigris are stories of resistance against the forces that would see it die, a testament to the unbreakable bond between a people and their river. This enduring narrative power proves that the Tigris is far more than water. It is an eternal wellspring for the human imagination, a mirror in which we have seen reflected our gods, our fears, our ambitions, and our enduring hope for renewal. Yet for all its unique volatility, the story of the Tigris is far from alone in the grand narrative of human history. To truly appreciate its distinct character, we must widen our gaze and place it alongside the other great rivers that gave birth to the world's earliest civilizations: the Nile, the Indus, and the Yellow River. Each of these powerful waterways acted as a cradle, but the shape of that cradle and the society that grew within it were profoundly shaped by the river's specific personality. This comparative view is like looking at different experiments in civilization building, each running with a different set of natural conditions, and the results are utterly fascinating. The most immediate and telling contrast is with the Nile. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile was a model of celestial reliability. Its annual flood was so predictable it formed the very basis of their calendar, arriving with the summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands and gently spreading a fresh layer of rich, black silt across the floodplain every year. This benevolent consistency allowed for a remarkably stable and enduring civilization. Egyptian society could afford to be more decentralized for long periods. The pharaoh was a god-king, but the day-to-day management of agriculture did not require the same level of intense, centralized bureaucratic control. Their worldview reflected this harmony, centered on concepts of cyclical renewal, balance, and eternal order, which we see in their art, their religion, and their monumental architecture designed to last for eternity. The Tigris, by stark contrast, was a tempestuous and unpredictable force. Its floods were not gentle annual events but violent, capricious, and potentially catastrophic, arriving at different times and with ferocious intensity. This fundamental environmental difference created a vastly different societal pressure. To survive and harness such a volatile river required immense, coordinated labor to build and maintain complex irrigation networks and protective dikes. This necessity, as we've seen, forged powerful, centralized states in Mesopotamia, first priestly hierarchies and then autocratic kings who could organize thousands of people for these massive public works projects. The Tigris didn't encourage a belief in cosmic balance. It fostered a worldview where humanity was in a constant struggle against chaotic natural forces, a theme deeply embedded in their myths like the Epic of Gilgamesh. When we shift our view east to the Indus Valley civilization, we encounter another fascinating variation on the theme. The Indus River, like the Tigris, was prone to unpredictable flooding and carried immense amounts of silt, yet the society that flourished along its banks from around 2600 BCE presents a striking archaeological puzzle. The great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveal an incredible emphasis on uniformity, standardization, and sophisticated urban planning on a scale unmatched elsewhere in the ancient world. They built massive citadels, elaborate drainage systems, and public baths, all laid out on a precise grid pattern across a vast geographical area. What's most remarkable and so different from Mesopotamia is what we don't find. There is little evidence of grandiose palaces, towering temples, or elaborate royal tombs. There are no obvious depictions of mighty kings or conquering heroes. This suggests a society that may have been organized more collectively, perhaps by a class of wealthy merchants or enlightened priests, with a focus on civic order and hygiene rather than the glorification of a single ruler. Their ability to manage their river's challenges seems to have produced a unique and surprisingly modern form of social organization that valued public works over personal aggrandizement. Their eventual decline, too, is shrouded in mystery but is often linked to a proposed shift in the river's course, combined with climatic changes, showing that even the most well-planned and seemingly resilient civilizations were not immune to the whims of their water source. Finally, the story of China's Yellow River offers what might be the most powerful parallel to the Tigris in terms of its demanding nature and its profound influence on the structure of the state. The Yellow River is not called China's Sorrow for nothing. It is the most silt-laden river on Earth, and its history is a relentless cycle of catastrophic flooding as its bed slowly silts up, causing the river to burst its banks and carve a new, devastating course to the sea. Taming this monstrous, unpredictable force required a mobilization of labor and resources so immense that many historians argue it was the primary catalyst for the development of a strong, centralized, bureaucratic state in China. The legendary Emperor Yu the Great was said to have gained the mandate of heaven not through military conquest, but through his successful efforts to control the floods by organizing dredging and dike-building projects. This established a powerful precedent. The right to rule in China was intrinsically linked to the ability to manage water for the public good. This created a hydraulic society where the state's authority was absolute and its administrative reach was deep, all necessary to coordinate the millions of peasants needed to maintain the ever-growing system of dikes and canals. The parallel to the Tigris is clear, a volatile river demanding strong central control, but the Yellow River took this dynamic to an even greater extreme, embedding the principle of water management so deeply into the ideology of governance that it became a defining feature of Chinese civilization for millennia. Placing the Tigris beside these other great rivers does more than just satisfy our historical curiosity. It extracts universal lessons that resonate with urgent clarity today. From the Nile, we learn that environmental predictability can foster cultural stability and a deep connection to the natural world. From the Indus, we see that a focus on collective, civic-minded infrastructure can be a powerful alternative to autocratic rule. And from the Tigris and the Yellow River, we understand that volatile, demanding environments tend to create powerful, centralized states, a dynamic that can lead to incredible achievements, but also to extreme social hierarchies and a brittle dependence on complex, state-managed systems. The common thread weaving through all these stories is that the relationship between a civilization and its river is a dance of adaptation. The river provides the possibilities and sets the constraints, and the society develops the technologies, social structures, and belief systems to respond. The ultimate lesson, written in the silt of all these rivers, is that sustainability hinges on understanding this delicate balance. You cannot impose a Nile-based system of governance on a Tigris-type river, nor can you expect a collective, Indus-style society to emerge from the top-down demands of controlling the Yellow River. Each river requires a management philosophy tailored to its own unique ecology. For our modern world, facing our own impending water crises, this historical comparative analysis is an invaluable guide. It teaches us that there is no one-size-fits-all solution for river management. The strategies for sharing the waters of the Colorado River in the American Southwest must be different from those for managing the seasonal monsoonal floods of the Ganges-Brahmaputra system. The key is to look to the past to understand the deep-seated ecological and historical context of each river basin, and to craft policies that are as unique and adaptive as the rivers themselves. The ghosts of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and ancient China all whisper the same warning. Those who fail to learn the specific language of their river are doomed to repeat the fate of the silt and ruins that now lie buried beneath its banks. Reflecting on this 3,000-year saga, the story of the Tigris reveals itself not as a series of isolated historical events, but as a single, continuous lesson written in water and silt. It is a timeless narrative that speaks to the very core of the human condition, our breathtaking ambition to reshape the world, our brilliant innovation in the face of adversity, and our profound vulnerability to the forces we can never fully control. The river, in its endless flow, has been the one constant, playing the dual role of benefactor and adversary. It offered the gift of fertility that built the world's first cities, and then, with a shift in its current or a change in the climate, it could just as easily become an agent of ruin, washing away the very empires it helped create. This duality is the heart of the story, a reminder that nature is not a resource to be conquered but a partner in a delicate, often precarious dance. The lessons whispered from these ancient ruins are not dusty artifacts. They are urgent warnings etched for our modern age. The Sumerians teach us about the hidden costs of our solutions, how the very irrigation canals that brought them life also carried the slow poison of salinization. The Akkadians and Assyrians show us the peril of building societies that are too efficient, too centralized, and too brittle, magnificent houses of cards that cannot withstand the inevitable environmental shock. The Babylonians demonstrate that even the most sophisticated legal codes and engineering marvels cannot legislate away the fundamental geological forces of a river. Their collective downfall shouts a single, unifying truth. Civilizations do not typically fall from a single, dramatic invasion, but from a toxic cocktail of their own internal choices meeting an external climatic shift. They overexploited their greatest resource, failed to adapt to changing conditions, and prioritized short-term gain over long-term resilience. In an era of our own global environmental crises, from climate change to water scarcity, these are not abstract historical concepts. They are a mirror held up to our own world, a checklist of pitfalls we are in danger of repeating on a planetary scale. This history, therefore, is not a chronicle of doom but a call to inspired action. It is a deep well of wisdom from which we can draw the foresight to navigate our own future. The story of the Tigris urges us to move from a mindset of domination to one of collaboration, with the river, with the land, and with each other. It champions the need for international cooperation over nationalist water hoarding, for sustainable adaptation over brute force engineering. It asks us to value the health of the entire ecosystem, from the mountain headwaters to the marshland delta, understanding that the resilience of nature is the foundation of our own. Let the ghosts of Nineveh, and Baghdad inspire us to build systems that are flexible, to invest in solutions that nurture rather than extract, and to make choices that ensure the great rivers of our world can continue to sustain life for the next 3,000 years, rather than becoming monuments to our own hubris. This is our chapter to write.